The billionaire's heart stopped when he saw her. Not from the disease eating him alive. Not from the failing valve that had him gasping for air in a hospital bed that cost more per night than most people earned in a month, but from recognizing the eyes of the daughter he left to die in the mountains 20 years ago. She was now the only doctor who could save him. And she was standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with those same dark eyes he'd seen in his rearview mirror as he drove away, deciding whether to let him live or watch him die the way he'd watched her disappear into the wilderness. This is the story of a man who threw away his child like garbage and lived to beg her for mercy. This is the story of what happens when the powerless become powerful and the forgotten become unforgettable. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Lagos, midnight in New York, afternoon in Sydney, or evening in London, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The fluorescent lights in St. Catherine's Hospital hummed with that particular frequency that made everything feel sterile and final, the kind of sound that reminded you that life here existed on machines and monitors and the mercy of people in white coats who held your fate in their hands. Richard Monroe had never paid attention to hospital sounds before. He'd never had to. At 65 years old, he'd spent his life insulated by wealth, so vast it made problems disappear before they reached him, surrounded by assistants and lawyers and doctors who appeared when summoned and vanished when dismissed. But now he lay in room 847, connected to tubes and wires and machines that beeped his mortality in steady, unforgiving rhythms, and every sound reminded him that money couldn't buy its way out of a failing heart. The valve disease had progressed faster than anyone predicted. 6 months ago, he felt invincible. 3 months ago, he felt tired. Last month, he collapsed in his office, and the parade of specialists who followed all said the same thing with different levels of delicacy. He needed surgery. Complex, dangerous, rare surgery. The kind only a handful of surgeons in the country could perform. And only one in the region. She was supposed to arrive today for the consultation. This miracle worker, everyone whispered about, the youngest cardiothoracic specialist to ever master the procedure he needed. He'd paid a fortune to get her here. Money still worked for some things. The door opened without a knock, the way doctors' doors always do, as if privacy becomes negotiable when your body is failing. Richard turned his head against the pillow, the motion taking more effort than it should, his breath shallow, and careful like his lungs had forgotten how to work without thinking about it. He expected someone older, more experienced, someone whose face carried the weight of years in operating rooms. Instead, a woman walked in who couldn't have been more than 30, maybe younger, her white coat crisp and spotless, a stethoscope draped around her neck like a symbol of authority she wore without effort. She was beautiful in that quiet, devastating way that made you look twice, her dark skin smooth and warm under the harsh hospital lights, her hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the elegant line of her neck and jaw. She carried a tablet in one hand and his chart in the other, her movements precise and unhurried, like she'd done this 1,000 times and knew exactly how much power she held in this moment. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart, deep brown, almost black, with flecks of gold that caught the light when she looked up at him. Eyes he'd seen before, eyes that haunted him in dreams he never talked about, eyes he'd last seen filled with tears and terror and betrayal in his rearview mirror 20 years ago. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, stealing what little breath he had left. His monitor started beeping faster, the numbers climbing on the screen beside his bed, and somewhere in the back of his mind he registered that his blood pressure was spiking, his heart rate accelerating, but those medical facts felt distant and irrelevant compared to the impossible reality standing at the foot of his bed. It couldn't be her. She'd been 8 years old, small and fragile and sick, left in the mountains with nothing because he convinced himself it was easier that way, cleaner, a problem solved rather than a life destroyed. She couldn't have survived. The wilderness, the cold nights, the lack of medication for the illness that made her weak and expensive, there was no way she'd made it out. He checked once, hired a private investigator 6 months after he'd left her there, some remaining thread of guilt or curiosity pulling at him in the dark hours of the morning. The investigator found nothing. No body, no trace, no evidence she'd ever existed beyond the birth certificate he'd had sealed and the medical records he'd had destroyed. He'd taken that nothing as confirmation and pushed it down deep, buried it under new marriages and new children and business deals that made him richer and more untouchable with every passing year. But now she stood here, alive and whole and powerful, and the way she looked at him made him understand that survival had turned her into something he never anticipated. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there studying him with the clinical detachment of a surgeon assessing a problem to solve, her eyes moving from his face to the monitors to the chart in her hands. The silence stretched and twisted, thick with 20 years of absence and questions that had no good answers. Richard opened his mouth to say something, anything, but his throat closed around the words, and all that came out was a weak, gasping sound that made him hate himself. She tilted her head slightly, the movement so familiar it sent him spinning back to a memory of a little girl who used to tilt her head exactly that way when she was thinking, when she was trying to understand something her 8-year-old mind couldn't quite grasp, like why her new stepmother looked at her with such cold dislike, or why her father stopped hugging her after her mother died. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured and carrying an edge of something he couldn't quite name. Not anger, not exactly, but something sharper and more controlled. "Mr. Monroe," she said, and the formal address felt like a slap, a deliberate distance placed between them. "I'm Dr. Grace Monroe. I've reviewed your case. You have severe aortic valve disease with regurgitation and stenosis. Without surgical intervention within the next 2 weeks, you have a 90% chance of fatal cardiac arrest. The surgery you need is complex, high risk. Only a handful of surgeons in the country are qualified to perform it, and I'm the only one in this region." She paused, letting those words settle in the air between them, letting him understand exactly how completely his life now rested in her hands. Then she took one step closer to his bed, close enough that he could see the tiny scar on her left temple, faded but still visible, a reminder of something that happened in mountains he tried not to think about. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him want to look away but couldn't, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped even lower, intimate and terrible. "And yes, Mr. Monroe, I am your daughter, the one you left to die in the mountains 20 years ago, the one you drove away from and never looked back for. I'm the only person who can save your life now, so you're going to lie there and think very carefully about what that means. If you're already feeling this tension, hit that subscribe button right now, because Olivia the Storyteller brings you stories like this every week. And if you don't subscribe, come to the comments and tell me why you're willing to miss endings like this. Now, let's go back to where it all began." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and Richard Monroe felt something inside him crack open, not his failing heart but something deeper, the carefully constructed walls he built around that day 20 years ago when he'd made a choice that turned him into a monster. His hands started trembling against the thin hospital sheets, the kind of trembling that comes from somewhere beyond cold or fear, from the place where your body realizes that the past you buried isn't dead at all but has been growing stronger in the dark, waiting for exactly this moment to rise up and face you. He tried to speak, his lips forming the beginning of her name, but she held up one hand to stop him, a gesture so commanding and final that he obeyed without thinking, the same way he used to obey his own father when he was young and powerless and afraid. Grace didn't move closer, and she didn't step back. She simply stood there at the foot of his bed with the kind of stillness that comes from complete control, the kind of presence that made everyone else in the room feel like they were intruding on something ancient and inevitable. She wasn't the small, fragile, sick little girl he remembered, the one who used to cough at night until she couldn't breathe, the one whose medical bills piled up on his desk like accusations, the one whose face reminded him too much of Elena, his first wife, the woman he'd actually loved before she died and left him alone with the living proof of what he'd lost. This Grace was something else entirely. She was tall, strong, radiating the kind of quiet power that came from surviving things that should have killed you and deciding to become exceptional instead of bitter. Her white coat wasn't just clothing. It was armor. It was proof. It was the ultimate reversal of everything he'd assumed about how her story would end. The heart monitor beside his bed continued its frantic beeping, numbers climbing higher as his body tried to process what his mind couldn't accept. A nurse appeared in the doorway, drawn by the alarm, her face concerned and professional. But Grace turned her head just slightly, made eye contact with the nurse, and gave the smallest shake of her head. The nurse hesitated, clearly uncertain, but something in Grace's expression made her nod and back out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her. That single exchange told Richard everything he needed to know about who his daughter had become. She had authority here. She had respect. She had power. And right now, she was choosing to use all of it to make him sit in his fear and face what he'd done. The silence that followed felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only seconds. Richard's mind raced through possibilities, through excuses, through explanations that might make sense of the inexcusable. He'd been overwhelmed. He'd been grieving. Victoria had convinced him it was necessary. The medical bills were crushing them. Grace was going to die anyway. The doctors had said her condition was progressive and incurable, so why bankrupt the family for a few more years of suffering? These were the lies he'd told himself in the dark, the stories he'd used to sleep at night, the justifications that turned abandonment into something that sounded almost reasonable if you didn't look at it too closely. But now, staring at the woman his daughter had become, every single excuse turned to ash in his mouth. Grace finally moved, walking slowly to the side of his bed, her steps measured and deliberate. She pulled up the doctor's stool and sat down, bringing herself to eye level with him, close enough that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, evidence of years of studying under harsh lights and long shifts, and the kind of focus it takes to become the best at something impossible. Close enough that he could smell the faint scent of antiseptic and coffee that clung to all doctors who live half their lives in hospitals. Close enough that he couldn't look away or pretend this wasn't happening. She set the tablet down on the table beside his bed and folded her hands in her lap, the gesture almost peaceful if you didn't see the tension in her shoulders, the slight clench of her jaw, the way her eyes never stopped evaluating him like he was a problem she was trying to decide whether to solve or let nature handle. "You're wondering how I survived," she said, and it wasn't a question. Her voice was softer now, but no less devastating, the kind of soft that comes before the knife goes in. "You're wondering how an 8-year-old girl with a chronic illness and no food and no medicine and no shelter made it out of the mountains alive when you were so certain she wouldn't. You probably even checked, didn't you? Sent someone to look, just once, just enough to ease whatever tiny piece of conscience you had left. And when they found nothing, you took that as permission to forget. You took that as proof that you'd made the right choice, the practical choice, the choice that let you move on with your new wife and your new son and your new life where I didn't exist anymore." Richard's breath caught in his throat. She was right about all of it, every single word, and hearing it spoken aloud made him feel like he was being dissected, layer by layer, every ugly truth exposed under lights that were too bright to hide anything. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't that simple, that life had been complicated, and Victoria had been persuasive, and the stress of losing Elena had broken something in him. But Grace's eyes stopped him cold. Those eyes had seen things he couldn't imagine. Those eyes had survived things he'd condemned her to. Those eyes had earned the right to speak without interruption. "I almost did die," she continued, her voice taking on a distant quality, like she was looking at something far away that only she could see. 3 days in those mountains with no water, no food, my medication running out, my body shutting down. I was so thirsty I tried to lick dew off rocks. I was so hungry I ate grass until I threw up. I was so cold at night I couldn't feel my fingers or toes, and I thought that was it, that was how it would end. 8 years old and dying alone because my father decided I wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Do you know what that does to a child, Mr. Monroe? Do you know what it feels like to understand at 8 years old that your father looked at you and decided your life had no value?" The question hung between them like a blade, and Richard felt something wet on his cheeks and realized with distant surprise that he was crying. He hadn't cried in decades, had trained himself out of the weakness of tears, but apparently his body had decided this moment was beyond his control. The tears came silently, rolling down his face and into the thin hospital pillow, and he made no move to wipe them away because what was the point? What was dignity compared to what he'd done? Grace watched him cry with no visible emotion, no satisfaction, no pity, just that same clinical observation that doctors use when they're monitoring a patient's vital signs. After a long moment, she reached over and adjusted something on his foreline, a gesture so casual and professional it felt surreal. "Your potassium levels are low," she said matter-of-factly. "That's contributing to the irregular heartbeat. I'm increasing the supplementation. Then she sat back and continued as if she'd never stopped. Someone found me on the 4th day. A man who lived in a cabin so far up the mountain that most people didn't even know it existed. He was a doctor once. Did you know that? Before he lost his family and decided the world was too painful to be part of anymore. He was hiking his supply trail when he found me lying under a rock overhang, barely breathing, my lips cracked and bleeding, my skin burning with fever. He carried me 3 miles back to his cabin. 3 miles. Through terrain that would have killed most people. And then he saved my life. Richard's hands gripped the sheets tighter, his knuckles white. Part of him was grateful, desperately grateful that someone had found her, that she'd survived, that the universe had stepped in to correct his catastrophic failure. But another part of him, the part he hated, felt something darker. Resentment, maybe. Or fear. Because her survival meant accountability. Her survival meant he couldn't hide from what he'd done anymore. His name was Marcus Chen, Grace said, and there was warmth in her voice now, a softness that made it clear this man meant something to her that Richard never would. He spent 2 weeks getting my medication, managing my illness, teaching me how to live. And then he did something he never did. He asked me what I wanted. An 8-year-old girl, and he asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted to learn. I wanted to read his medical books. I wanted to understand how bodies work and how to fix them. And you know what he said? He said yes. He said if I was going to survive, I should survive with purpose. She leaned forward slightly, and Richard could see the steel in her eyes, the absolute certainty of someone who had rebuilt themselves from nothing and knew exactly what they were made of. He homeschooled me, taught me medicine, biology, chemistry, mathematics. We lived in that cabin for 10 years, Mr. Monroe. 10 years of studying by lamplight, of practicing sutures on pieces of leather, of learning every bone and muscle and nerve in the human body. I took my GED at 16 and tested into medical school at 17. Full scholarship. I graduated top of my class. I completed my residency in 3 years instead of 5. I became a cardiothoracic specialist at 26, the youngest in the country. And now, at 28 years old, I'm the only person in this region who can perform the surgery that will save your life. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thin, like all the oxygen had been sucked out and replaced with the weight of 2 decades of consequence. Richard stared at his daughter and saw not just her survival but her triumph, not just her escape but her absolute domination of a situation that should have destroyed her. She had taken his worst act and turned it into her greatest strength. She had become powerful in the exact way that made his weakness most obvious. So here's what's going to happen, Grace said, standing up smoothly and picking up her tablet. I'm going to leave this room. I'm going to review your case files in detail. I'm going to consult with my colleagues and determine the exact surgical approach your specific condition requires. And then I'm going to make a decision about whether I'm going to save your life or whether I'm going to refer you to the next closest specialist, who happens to be in Seattle, which means a 6-hour flight you probably won't survive and a 3-month waiting list that will definitely kill you before your name comes up. I'm going to make that decision based on my professional judgment and my ethical obligations as a doctor, not based on what you deserve, because frankly, Mr. Monroe, if we operated on people based on what they deserve, half the patients in this hospital would die and the other half would live forever. She walked toward the door, her hand on the handle, and Richard found his voice finally, weak and broken but desperate. Grace, please. Just those 2 words, barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of 20 years of absence and regret. She paused without turning around, her shoulders tense, and for a moment he thought she might walk out without another word. But then she looked back over her shoulder, and what he saw in her face wasn't hatred or anger or even satisfaction. It was something far more devastating. It was indifference. The look you give something that used to matter but doesn't anymore. My father's name was Marcus Chen, she said quietly. He died 3 years ago. Heart attack. Sudden and massive. Nothing anyone could have done. I held his hand while he went. He told me he was proud of me. He told me I'd become everything he hoped and more. He told me that finding me in those mountains was the thing that saved his life as much as he saved mine. That's what a father sounds like, Mr. Monroe. In case you were wondering. Then she opened the door and walked out, leaving him alone with the beeping machines and the fluorescent lights, and the crushing understanding that he'd thrown away something irreplaceable and now had to beg its ghost to save him. If you're sitting there thinking about the people you've abandoned, the bridges you've burned, the choices you can't take back, then you understand why you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller right now. Because we don't just tell stories, we tell truths that make you look at your own life differently. And if you won't subscribe, if you're going to scroll past this without hitting that button, then come to the comments and tell me why. Tell me what's stopping you from joining a community that faces hard truths and celebrates survival. I'm reading every word. Now let me take you back 20 years and show you exactly how perfect things looked before everything fell apart. 20 years earlier, the Monroe mansion sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured land in the wealthiest suburb outside the city, the kind of place where the driveways were longer than most people's streets and the houses were so far apart you could scream, and no one would hear you. It was the kind of wealth that didn't announce itself with gold fixtures and marble columns, though it had those too, but with the quiet certainty that money could solve any problem, buy any solution, erase any inconvenience. The house had 12 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a kitchen bigger than most apartments. There was a pool that heated itself, gardens maintained by people Grace never saw, and a 3-car garage that held vehicles worth more than what most families earned in a decade. Richard Monroe had built his fortune in commercial real estate and private equity, the kind of business where you made money by having money, where your signature on a document could make or break entire companies. He was 45 years old, handsome in that sharp-suited way that powerful men carry themselves, with graying temples that made him look distinguished rather than old and a smile he could turn on and off like a light switch depending on who was watching. But 6 months ago, everything that mattered had collapsed. Elena Monroe, Grace's mother, had died suddenly from a brain aneurysm while gardening on a Tuesday afternoon. One moment she was planting roses, humming something Grace couldn't quite hear from her bedroom window upstairs, and the next moment she was on the ground, gone before the ambulance even arrived. Grace was 7 years old when it happened, almost 8, old enough to understand that her mother was dead but too young to understand that dead meant forever, that it meant no more bedtime stories, no more soft hands braiding her hair, no more voice calling her name with actual love in it. The funeral had been enormous. Hundreds of people Grace didn't know telling her how sorry they were, how her mother was in a better place, how she wanted Grace to be strong. But none of them stayed. None of them came back after the service to sit with a little girl who kept waking up at night, calling for someone who would never answer. Richard had grieved in his own way, which meant he stopped coming home for dinner, stopped tucking Grace in at night, stopped looking at her directly because her face was too much like Elena's and the resemblance was a wound that wouldn't close. He threw himself into work, into 18-hour days and business trips that stretched for weeks, leaving Grace alone in that massive house with nannies who were kind but temporary, hired help who did their jobs, and went home to their own families. The mansion felt different without Elena. It felt like a museum, beautiful and cold and full of things you weren't supposed to touch. Grace would wander the halls at night, passing her mother's closed bedroom door, the room that still smelled faintly of her perfume, the room Richard couldn't bear to enter or change. She'd end up in the library, curling up in her mother's favorite chair, trying to feel close to something that was already slipping away like water through her fingers. Then Victoria arrived, and everything that was cold became frozen solid. Richard had met her at some charity gala 4 months after Elena died. Too soon by any reasonable standard, but grief makes people do desperate things, and Richard was desperate to feel something other than loss. Victoria Ashworth was 38, beautiful in that maintained way that required personal trainers and expensive salons, and knowing exactly which angles made you look best. She had blonde hair that fell in perfect waves, blue eyes that sparkled when she wanted them to, and a smile that never quite reached those eyes if you looked closely enough. She came from old money that had started to fade, the kind of family that still had the name and the connections but needed an infusion of new wealth to maintain the lifestyle. She saw Richard Monroe and saw salvation. He saw her and saw a way to stop feeling so alone. They were married 3 months after they met. A quiet ceremony that pretended to be tasteful but was really just rushed. And suddenly Grace had a stepmother who looked at her like she was a stain on expensive carpet. Victoria moved into the mansion with the efficiency of someone taking over territory, redecorating Elena's favorite rooms, replacing photos on the mantel, erasing any trace of the woman who'd lived there before. Grace's mother's rose garden was torn up and replaced with modern landscaping. Her favorite paintings were moved to storage. Her books disappeared from the library shelves. It was like watching someone delete her mother's existence one piece at a time, and Grace was too young to stop it, too powerless to do anything but watch and hurt and try to stay out of the way. Victoria wasn't cruel in obvious ways, not at first. She didn't yell or hit or do anything you could point to and call abuse. She was cold, dismissive. She'd walk into a room where Grace was reading and act like she wasn't there. She'd plan family dinners and forget to set a place for Grace. She'd talk about her plans for the house, for their future, and the word "our" never included a little girl who wasn't hers. And then James was born, and everything Grace feared became real. Victoria's son from her previous marriage, James Ashworth, moved in at age 6, and suddenly the house had a golden child, a boy who could do no wrong, who got attention and affection and the kind of love that was visible and constant, and everything Grace had stopped receiving. James was small for his age, with his mother's blonde hair and a face that looked angelic and innocent even when he was being cruel, which was often. He'd break Grace's toys, and Victoria would blame Grace for leaving them where he could reach them. He'd push her down the stairs, and Victoria would scold her for not watching where she was going. He'd tell lies about things Grace never did, and Victoria would believe him every single time because he was hers and Grace was just the unwanted reminder of the woman Richard used to love. Richard watched all of this happen and said nothing. That was the part that hurt most. Years later, when Grace would think back and try to understand how it all fell apart, her father wasn't stupid. He wasn't blind. He could see what Victoria was doing, how she was slowly pushing his daughter out of her own home, erasing her piece by piece. But he was tired, and grief had hollowed him out, and Victoria made him feel wanted in ways that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with not being alone. So he chose the easier path. He chose silence. He chose to pretend everything was fine, and that Grace was just being difficult, just having trouble adjusting, just being overly sensitive about normal stepfamily dynamics. He chose Victoria's version of reality because it required less from him, and every time he made that choice, he drove another nail into the coffin of whatever relationship he might have saved with his daughter. Then Grace got sick, and the final piece of her destruction fell into place. It started small, the way these things do. She'd get tired more easily than other kids. She'd have trouble breathing after running. Her heart would race at strange times, pounding so hard in her chest she thought everyone could hear it. Elena would have noticed immediately, would have taken her to doctors and demanded answers. But Elena was gone, and Richard was absent, and Victoria certainly wasn't going to advocate for medical care for a child she saw as a burden. By the time Grace collapsed at school and the nurse called an ambulance, the condition had progressed to the point where specialists were involved, where words like chronic and incurable and expensive started floating through conversations Grace wasn't supposed to hear. The diagnosis was a rare congenital heart condition, something that should have been caught earlier but wasn't, something that would require lifelong medication and monitoring and care that cost thousands of dollars every month. Richard's face when the doctor explained the prognosis was something Grace would never forget. Not concern or fear or even sadness, just calculation. She could see him doing the math, adding up the years and the costs, weighing the investment against the likelihood of return. She was 8 years old and watching her father evaluate whether she was worth the money it would take to keep her alive. The medication helped but didn't cure. The doctor's appointments piled up. The bills arrived in thick envelopes that Richard would open at his desk with his jaw clenched and his eyes cold. And Victoria, perfect Victoria, would stand behind him with her hand on his shoulder and say things in that voice that sounded concerned but wasn't. Things like maybe they should look into state programs. Maybe they should consider that Grace's quality of life wasn't going to be good anyway. Maybe they should think about what was best for everyone, not just her. Grace started having nightmares, waking up gasping and afraid in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. She'd hear Victoria and Richard arguing late at night, their voices carrying through the vents, Victoria's high and insistent, Richard's low and tired. She couldn't make out all the words, but she heard her name, heard expensive, heard burden, heard phrases like we need to think about our future, and she's not even yours, not really. She's Elena's and Elena's gone. Those words burrowed into Grace like parasites, eating away at whatever security she had left. She started staying in her room more, speaking less, trying to make herself smaller and quieter and less noticeable, as if being invisible might make her less of a problem to solve. One night, about 2 months before everything ended, Grace woke up thirsty and crept downstairs to the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. The house was dark except for a light coming from Richard's study, and she heard voices, low and serious, the kind of adult conversation that stops when children enter. She should have gone back to bed. She should have gotten her water and left. But something made her pause outside the study door. Something made her press herself against the wall in the shadows and listen to words that would poison everything that came after. Victoria's voice came first, sharp with frustration. She's a constant reminder of Elena. Every time you look at her, I can see it in your face. You're mourning a ghost while I'm standing right here, alive and trying to build a future with you. Then Richard's voice, heavy with something that might have been guilt, or might have been resignation. She's my daughter. And Victoria's response, cold and final. She's costing us a fortune, Richard. The medication alone is more than we spend on James's private school. And for what? So she can live a few more years? The doctor said the condition is progressive. It's not going to get better. You're throwing money into a hole that has no bottom, and meanwhile, we're putting off the life we could be living. James deserves better than this. I deserve better than this. And honestly, keeping her alive like this, watching her struggle, isn't it cruel? Isn't it kinder to let nature take its course? The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Grace stood frozen in the hallway, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they'd hear it, her small hands pressed against the wall to keep herself from falling. She waited for her father to say something, to defend her, to say that she was worth it, that love wasn't about cost-benefit analysis, that you didn't give up on your child just because they were expensive or inconvenient or reminded you of someone you lost. But when Richard finally spoke, his voice was quiet and defeated, and it broke something in Grace that never fully healed. She's a reminder of Elena, and she's costing us a fortune. You're right. Something has to change. If you're sitting there feeling sick to your stomach, if you're thinking about the times adults failed you or the moments when you realized you weren't as wanted as you thought, then you know exactly why you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. We tell the stories that make you feel everything because real life isn't comfortable, and the truth is often devastating. Hit that subscribe button now, because next week I'm bringing you a story about a teacher who discovered her entire school board was embezzling money meant for disabled students. You won't want to miss what happened when she exposed them. And if you're not going to subscribe, come into the comments and tell me why stories like Grace's don't matter enough to you to click a button. I'll be reading every single one. Grace stood in that dark hallway for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, her small body trembling with something beyond cold, something that came from deep inside where hope used to live. She'd heard stories about children who weren't wanted, read books about orphans and stepfamilies where the unwanted child was locked in towers or forced to sleep by the fireplace or turned into servants in their own homes. But those were fairy tales, and fairy tales had magic, had fairy godmothers, had happy endings where good was rewarded and evil was punished. This was real life, and in real life, an 8-year-old girl with a heart condition could stand outside her father's study and hear him agree that she cost too much to keep alive. In real life, there were no fairy godmothers. There was just a small girl and a father who had stopped loving her and a stepmother who had never started, and the terrible understanding that something has to change meant something terrible was coming. She never told anyone what she heard that night. Who would she tell? There were no grandparents. Elena had been an only child and her parents had died before Grace was born. Richard's family had disowned him years ago over some business deal gone wrong, the kind of falling out that rich people have where pride matters more than blood. The nannies were temporary employees who smiled and did their jobs and went home at the end of their shifts. Grace's friends at school were 8 years old, too young to understand and too powerless to help even if they did. So she carried those words inside her like stones, heavy and sharp, cutting her from the inside every time she remembered them. She's costing us a fortune. Something has to change. Let nature take its course. She started watching her father and Victoria more carefully after that, looking for signs of what change might mean, but they were careful around her, their faces neutral, their voices pleasant, like actors performing a play where everything was fine. 2 weeks after that conversation, Richard made an announcement over breakfast, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness that adults use when they're trying to sell you something you don't want. They were going on a family bonding trip, he said, just the 4 of them, to the mountain property he'd inherited from his grandfather years ago. It was beautiful up there, he explained, peaceful and remote, a place where they could reconnect as a family without the distractions of daily life. Victoria's face lit up with enthusiasm that looked practiced, like she'd been preparing for this performance. She talked about fresh air and quality time, and how wonderful it would be for them all to get away from the city, from the stress, from everything that had been weighing them down. James barely looked up from his cereal, clearly bored by the whole idea, but he nodded when his mother looked at him expectantly, agreeing that yes, it sounded fun, sure, whatever. Grace felt something twist in her stomach, a warning that came from that place where children sense danger even when they can't name it. But louder than the warning was something else, something desperate and foolish and heartbreaking. Hope, because maybe this was her chance to fix things, to show Richard that she could be easy and pleasant and not a burden, to prove that she was worth keeping, to win back some small piece of the father who used to read her bedtime stories and call her his little star. Maybe in the mountains, away from Victoria's constant coldness and the pressure of bills and medication costs, maybe he would remember that he loved her once. Maybe he would choose her. So when he asked if she wanted to go, if she was excited for their adventure, she nodded so hard her head hurt and said yes. Yes, please. Thank you. With a brightness in her voice that came from pure desperation dressed up as joy. They left on a Friday morning, loading up Richard's luxury SUV with suitcases and coolers full of expensive food and everything James wanted to bring, which was apparently half his toy collection. Grace packed her small backpack with 3 days of medication, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's locket that she wore every day, and a book about birds that Elena had given her last Christmas. She sat in the back seat next to James, who immediately claimed the window and told her not to breathe on him, while Victoria sat up front adjusting the air conditioning and choosing music that only she liked. Richard drove with his sunglasses on and his jaw set, focused on the road ahead, and for a while, Grace let herself believe that this might actually be okay, that maybe this trip was exactly what it seemed to be, a chance to start over. The city fell away behind them, glass towers and gridlock traffic giving way to suburbs, then smaller towns, then open highway cutting through landscape that grew increasingly wild and beautiful. The mountains rose in the distance, blue and purple against the sky, their peaks still topped with snow even though it was late spring. Grace pressed her face to the window, watching the scenery change, watching civilization get further and further away. They passed through small towns that looked like something from another era, main streets with 3 stores and 1 gas station, places where everyone probably knew everyone and strangers were noticed. Then even those disappeared, and there was just road and trees and mountains getting closer, the terrain becoming rougher, the turns sharper, the air thinner. Victoria kept up a steady stream of cheerful commentary for the first hour, pointing out landmarks and making plans for what they'd do when they arrived. But eventually even she ran out of false enthusiasm and fell silent, scrolling through her phone until the signal dropped and there was nothing but static when she tried to make calls. James fell asleep against the window, his mouth open, drooling on his expensive jacket. Grace felt her medication wearing off, that familiar tightness in her chest that meant her heart was working harder than it should, the exhaustion that came in waves and made her want to close her eyes. But she fought to stay awake, afraid that if she slept she might miss something important, some sign of what was really happening. They'd been driving for almost 4 hours when Richard turned off the main highway onto a dirt road that barely deserved the name, more like 2 tire tracks through wilderness with grass growing up the middle. The SUV bounced and jolted over ruts and rocks, branches scraping against the sides, dust billowing up behind them in clouds that turned the world behind them into a brown haze. Grace's chest got tighter, her breathing more labored, and she tried to be quiet about it, tried not to let them hear her struggle, but Victoria's head turned slightly, and Grace saw the smallest smile touch the corner of her mouth, there and gone so fast you might have missed it if you weren't looking. That smile told Grace everything she needed to know but couldn't accept. This wasn't a family bonding trip. This was something else entirely. The road, if you could call it that, wound higher into the mountains, climbing through terrain that became increasingly hostile, beautiful in that vast, indifferent way that nature has where it doesn't care if you live or die, where your human concerns mean nothing against ancient rock and endless sky. They passed through stands of pines so thick the sunlight barely penetrated, across streams that ran wild with snow melt, past slopes covered in loose shale that looked like they could give way any second and send you tumbling down to places no one would ever find you. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, partly from the altitude, partly from the lack of medication starting to hit, partly from fear that was growing with every mile they traveled away from anything that resembled safety or civilization or help. After another hour of rough driving, Richard pulled the SUV into a clearing surrounded by towering pines and rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels watching over something they'd long ago stopped caring about. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was complete and absolute, the kind of quiet that comes from being so far from humanity that even the sounds of distant traffic or airplanes overhead don't exist. Just wind in the trees, birds calling from somewhere high up, and the ticking of the engine as it cooled. Grace's ears popped from the altitude. Her head felt light, fuzzy, the way it did when her heart wasn't getting enough oxygen to her brain. She needed her medication, needed water, needed to lie down, but she was afraid to say anything, afraid to draw attention, afraid of that smile she'd seen on Victoria's face. Richard and Victoria got out of the front seats without a word. James stirred and whined about being tired, about wanting to go home, but Victoria shushed him sharply and told him to stay in the car and be quiet. Through the window, Grace watched her father and stepmother walk a few feet away, their heads close together, talking in voices too low to hear. Richard's shoulders were tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Victoria's hand was on his arm, her mouth moving steadily, persuading, convincing, sealing some deal that had already been made before they left the mansion. Grace's hand started shaking. She pulled her backpack onto her lap, holding it like a shield, like if she just held on tight enough to the few things that were hers, maybe everything would be okay. Richard turned back toward the SUV, his face carved from stone, and opened Grace's door. The mountain air rushed in, cold and thin, and smelling of pine and something wild and ancient. He didn't look at her directly when he spoke. His eyes focused somewhere past her shoulder, like she was already gone. "Grace, get out. We need to talk." His voice was flat, emotionless, the way you might tell someone the time or give directions, like this was just another transaction, another item to check off some list he kept in his head where people were problems and problems had solutions. Grace's body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Every instinct she had screamed at her to stay in the car, to lock the doors, to refuse, but she was 8 years old, and he was her father, and children obey their parents even when everything inside them is screaming danger. She clutched her backpack and slid out of the seat, her legs shaky, her breathing labored. The ground was rocky and uneven, covered in pine needles and small stones that hurt through her thin shoes. She'd worn her good shoes, the ones she saved for special occasions, because she thought this was going to be special. She thought this was going to be the trip where her father remembered he loved her. Victoria stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, that same small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She looked satisfied, like someone watching a plan come together exactly as designed. James's face appeared in the car window, confused and uncertain, too young to understand what was happening but old enough to sense that something was very wrong. Richard walked a few steps away from the SUV, and Grace followed because what else could she do, her small legs struggling to keep up with his stride, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. He stopped in the middle of the clearing and finally turned to look at her. Grace stared up at her father, at this man who was supposed to protect her, who was supposed to love her no matter what, and she saw nothing in his eyes but the same calculation she'd seen at the hospital when the doctor explained her diagnosis. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're about to throw away, assessing, measuring, deciding. The silence stretched between them, broken only by wind in the trees and her own labored breathing, and somewhere far away, a bird's cry that sounded almost like a warning. When Richard spoke, his voice was quiet, but each word landed like a blow, precise and devastating and final. "Your mother is gone, Grace. She's been gone for 6 months, and she's not coming back. Looking at you every day, seeing her face in yours, it's like living with a ghost. I can't do it anymore. And the medical bills, the constant doctor's appointments, the medication that costs more every month. It's not sustainable. Victoria's right. You're too expensive. You're too much of a reminder of everything I lost. This is easier for everyone. This way I can move on. Victoria and James can have the life they deserve. And you won't have to suffer any more through treatments that aren't going to save you anyway. The doctor said your condition is progressive. You understand what that means, don't you? It means you're going to die eventually, no matter what we do. This is just letting nature take its course. This is kinder than dragging it out. The words hit Grace like physical blows, each one stealing more air from her lungs, making her chest tighter, making her vision blur at the edges. She couldn't process it, couldn't make sense of what he was saying, because fathers don't do this. Fathers don't abandon their children in the wilderness like trash. Fathers don't look at their daughters and call them too expensive to keep alive. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out at first, just small gasping noises that might have been the beginning of words or the beginning of screams. No, she finally managed, her voice small and broken. No, Daddy, please. I'll be better. I'll be so good. I won't complain about the medicine. I won't be expensive. I'll eat less. I'll stay in my room. I won't remind you of Mommy. I promise. I'll be different. I'll be whatever you want. Just please don't leave me here. Please. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with sobs that made her chest hurt worse, made breathing almost impossible. She reached for him, her small hands grasping at his shirt, and he stepped back like her touch burned him, like she was something contaminated that he needed to avoid. This isn't a negotiation, Grace, he said, and his voice was so cold, so empty of anything resembling love or regret or even basic human compassion that it was like listening to a stranger, like the man who used to be her father had been replaced by something that looked like him but had nothing inside. This decision is made. You'll understand someday. This is a mercy. He turned and walked back toward the SUV, his steps quick and purposeful, a man finishing an unpleasant task and eager to be done with it. Grace ran after him, stumbling on the rocky ground, her vision blurred by tears, her breath coming in wheezing gasps. Daddy, no. Please, I'm sorry for being sick. I'm sorry for costing money. I'm sorry Mommy died. Please don't leave me. Please, I love you, Daddy, please. She was begging now, completely broken, her pride and dignity shattered, because what did pride matter when you were 8 years old and your father was abandoning you to die? She grabbed his arm and he shook her off. Not violently but firmly, the way you brush off an insect that landed on you. Victoria had already gotten back in the passenger seat, her face visible through the window, watching the scene with something that looked almost like enjoyment, like this was entertaining to her, like watching a child beg for her life was some kind of victory. James was crying now too, his small face pressed against the window, his hand raised in something that might have been a wave, or might have been an attempt to stop what was happening. But Victoria said something sharp to him, and he ducked down, disappearing from view. Richard climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The sound was obscenely normal, just a car starting, the same sound you hear 1,000 times in your life and never think about. But in that moment, in that clearing, with Grace standing there alone and terrified and betrayed, it was the sound of the world ending. She ran to his window, pounding on the glass with her small fists. Please don't leave me. Please. I don't have food. I don't have water. I don't have my medicine. Daddy, please. I'll die out here. Please. He didn't look at her. He put the SUV in reverse and started backing up, and Grace ran alongside, still hitting the window, still begging, her voice getting more desperate and broken with every word. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. Please don't do this. Mommy wouldn't want this. Mommy would hate you for this. Please. The SUV stopped for just a second, and Grace thought maybe her words had gotten through. Maybe he was going to change his mind. Maybe there was still some piece of the man who used to be her father left inside. But he just shifted into drive, turned the wheel, and headed back down the rough dirt road they'd come up. Faster now, eager to put distance between himself and what he'd done. Grace chased the SUV as it pulled away, running as fast as her sick body would let her, screaming words that got lost in the sound of the engine and the wind and her own choking sobs. She ran until her legs gave out, and she fell hard on the rocky ground, scraping her knees and palms, and she lay there in the dirt watching the SUV disappear down the mountain, watching the dust cloud it left behind slowly settle, watching the last trace of her family vanish into the wilderness that was now her prison. The sound of the engine faded, grew distant, then disappeared completely, and the silence that replaced it was absolute and terrifying and final. She stayed on the ground for a long time, maybe minutes, maybe an hour, she couldn't tell. Her chest hurt from crying and from running and from her heart working too hard without the medication it needed. Her hands and knees burned where she'd scraped them. Her throat was raw from screaming. But worse than any physical pain was the understanding settling over her like a weight that would never lift. Her father had driven away. He'd looked at her and decided she wasn't worth saving. He'd left her in the mountains with nothing, no food, no water, no medicine, no way to survive. He'd left her to die, and he'd done it on purpose, carefully, deliberately, with planning and forethought. This wasn't an accident or a mistake, or something that happened in a moment of anger. This was premeditated. This was a father who'd sat at his desk and calculated the cost of his daughter's life, and decided the price was too high. Grace slowly pushed herself to sitting, her hands shaking, her whole body trembling with shock and fear and the terrible understanding that she was completely, utterly alone. She looked around the clearing, really seeing it for the first time. It was beautiful in that way that wild places are beautiful, all pine trees and rock formations and mountain sky, but it was also hostile, indifferent, dangerous. The sun was already starting to sink toward the horizon, and she had no idea what direction led back to civilization or how far she'd have to walk to find help. She didn't know how to survive in the wilderness. She was 8 years old and sick and alone, and she had maybe 3 days of medication in her backpack, maybe 2 bottles of water if she was remembering right, maybe some crackers she packed for the car ride. After that, nothing. The panic hit her then, real and visceral, making her heart race so fast she thought she might pass out. She needed help. She needed adults. She needed someone to find her and take her home, except she didn't have a home anymore, did she? Because the man who was supposed to be her home had just thrown her away like garbage. She started walking in the direction the SUV had gone, thinking maybe she could follow the tire tracks, maybe she could walk back down the mountain, but the road twisted and turned through terrain that all looked the same, and after a few minutes she wasn't sure if she was even going the right way anymore. The trees pressed in on all sides, tall and dark and making shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air was getting colder as the sun sank lower. Her medication was wearing off, and she could feel it, that familiar tightness in her chest getting worse, her breathing getting harder, exhaustion pulling at her like hands dragging her down. She walked for what felt like hours but was probably less than one, her small legs struggling over rough terrain, her good shoes already torn and dirty, until she physically couldn't walk anymore and had to stop. She found a large boulder and sat with her back against it, pulling her backpack onto her lap, taking inventory of what she had. 2 bottles of water, 3 days of pills, a change of clothes, her mother's locket, the bird book, and a granola bar she'd forgotten about. That was it. That was everything between her and death. She took 1 pill with a small sip of water, rationing, trying to make it last, and ate half the granola bar even though she wasn't hungry, even though the thought of food made her sick, because she didn't know when she'd eat again and her body needed fuel. Night was falling now, the sky turning from blue to purple to that deep darkness that only exists far from cities, where there are no streetlights or houses or anything human to push back the black. The temperature dropped fast, that mountain cold that goes straight through clothing and skin to settle in your bones. Grace hugged herself, shivering, her thin jacket completely inadequate against the chill. She heard sounds in the darkness, rustling in the underbrush, branches snapping, and something that might have been footsteps, or might have been her imagination, or might have been something she didn't want to think about. She remembered a nature documentary she'd watched once about wolves, about how they hunted in packs, about how they could smell weakness and fear. She didn't know if there were wolves in these mountains, but she didn't know there weren't, and in the darkness every sound became a threat, every shadow became something with teeth. She needed shelter, needed somewhere she could hide and wait for morning, because staying out in the open felt like suicide. She forced herself to stand, forced her exhausted body to move, scanning the rocks and trees for anything that might offer protection. That's when she saw it, maybe 20 yards away, a dark opening in the rock face, a shallow cave that was barely more than an indentation but was better than nothing. She stumbled toward it, her legs shaking with exhaustion and fear, and crawled inside, finding that it was just deep enough for her to sit with her back against stone, just protected enough to block the worst of the wind. Grace pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible, and that's when the crying started again, deep wrenching sobs that came from somewhere beyond thought or control. She cried for her mother, dead and gone and unable to save her. She cried for her father, who'd become a monster. She cried for herself, for the little girl who'd tried so hard to be good, who'd believed that love was enough, who'd thought family meant something. She cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty except for fear and cold and the slowly building understanding that she might actually die out here, that her father's calculation might be right, that this might be where her short, sad story ended. The wind picked up, howling through the rocks and trees with a sound that was almost like voices, almost like warnings. And then, cutting through the wind, she heard it. A howl, long and mournful and unmistakably animal, somewhere out in the darkness, not as far away as she wanted it to be. Then another howl answered it, from a different direction. Then another. Wolves. They were real and they were close, and Grace pressed herself harder against the back of the cave, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short gasps, every muscle in her body rigid with terror. She thought about her father in his luxury SUV, probably already home, probably already pretending she'd never existed. She thought about Victoria pouring herself a glass of wine and celebrating her victory. She thought about James in his warm bed, confused but safe. And she sat in a shallow cave in the mountains, 8 years old and sick and alone, listening to wolves howl in the darkness and wondering if she'd live to see morning. Right now, if you're feeling that knot in your stomach, you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. Because tomorrow I'm posting an even more devastating story. And if you don't subscribe, drop a comment telling me how you'll find these stories when they're buried by the algorithm. Let's continue. Grace survived that first night through nothing but terror and the stubborn refusal of her 8-year-old body to give up even when everything logical said it should. The wolves never came close enough to see, but she heard them throughout the long hours of darkness, their howls echoing off the rocks, sometimes near, sometimes distant, always reminding her that she was prey now, small and weak and alone in a world that had no mercy for the vulnerable. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just sat pressed against the back of that shallow cave with her eyes wide open in the blackness, her heart racing, her breath coming in short gasps that had as much to do with her illness as with fear. When dawn finally came, gray and cold and beautiful in a way that felt like mockery, she was still alive but had no idea what to do with that fact. Being alive meant facing another day of being abandoned, another day of slowly dying from thirst and hunger and the lack of medication that kept her heart functioning properly. The first day, she tried to be smart about survival, tried to remember things she'd read in books or seen in movies about lost people in the wilderness. She rationed her water carefully, taking only small sips, even though her mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. She ate the other half of her granola bar in tiny bites that she made herself chew slowly, trying to make it last, trying to trick her stomach into thinking it was getting more food than it was. She stayed near the cave because it was the only landmark she recognized, the only place that felt even remotely like shelter, and she was terrified that if she wandered too far she'd get completely lost and never find her way back to anything. She tried to collect dew from leaves in the early morning, licking the moisture off like she'd seen in a survival show once, but there wasn't enough to make any difference, and it tasted like dirt and made her gag. She looked for berries or anything edible, but had no idea what was safe and what was poison, and the thought of accidentally killing herself when she was trying so hard to survive seemed like the cruelest joke the universe could play. By the afternoon of that first day, the medication had worn off completely, and her heart started doing things that scared her more than the wolves had. It would race for no reason, pounding so hard she could see her chest moving, then slow down to almost nothing, then race again in rhythms that felt wrong and dangerous. Her chest hurt with every breath, a tightness that made her feel like she was breathing through a straw. She got dizzy when she stood up too fast, her vision going gray at the edges, and twice she nearly passed out and had to sit down quickly before she fell. She knew these were bad signs, knew her body was struggling without the medicine, but knowing didn't help because there was nothing she could do about it. She was 8 years old and dying slowly in the mountains, and no one was coming to save her because no one knew she was here, because her father had made sure of that. The second day was when hope started to die and desperation took its place. Grace woke up on the hard ground of the cave, her body so stiff and sore she could barely move, her mouth so dry her tongue felt like leather, her head pounding with a headache that made thinking difficult. She'd finished her water the night before, unable to ration it anymore because the thirst had become unbearable, and now she had nothing. She tried to find water, stumbling through the forest on legs that shook with every step, following the sound of what she thought might be a stream, but the terrain was rough and treacherous, and she fell twice, scraping her hands and knees worse, tearing her clothes, making herself bleed in ways that seemed dangerous even though she couldn't explain why. When she finally found water, a small creek running cold and clear over rocks, she threw herself down and drank directly from it, gulping it down so fast she made herself sick, her empty stomach rejecting the sudden influx of cold water, making her vomit up everything she just swallowed plus what little was left in her system from the granola bar. She lay by that creek for hours, too weak to move, too exhausted to care, drinking small sips and keeping them down through sheer willpower, soaking her torn clothes in the cold water and pressing them to her face and chest where her skin burned with fever. Because that was the other thing happening now, the fever that came when her heart condition got bad, when her body was under too much stress, when the careful balance of medication and rest that kept her stable was gone and her system was failing. She was burning up and freezing at the same time, shivering violently in the mountain air while her skin felt like it was on fire, her thoughts getting fuzzy and disconnected, memories of her mother mixing with present reality until she couldn't always tell what was real and what was fever dream. By the third day, Grace was barely conscious most of the time, existing in a twilight state between waking and sleeping where the boundaries between real and imagined had dissolved completely. She'd managed to crawl back to the cave at some point, though she couldn't remember doing it, following some animal instinct to return to shelter even when her rational mind had mostly shut down. She lay curled in a ball on the cold stone, her body doing things she had no control over, shaking and sweating and occasionally crying out words that made no sense, calling for her mother, calling for her father, begging people who weren't there to please help her, please not leave her, please come back. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin was gray. Her heartbeat was erratic and weak. The dehydration was severe now, critical, her body consuming itself trying to survive, shutting down non-essential functions, conserving what little energy remained for the most basic processes of staying alive. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching the cave, didn't register the shadow that fell across her face as someone blocked the morning light. Didn't understand at first that the voice speaking wasn't another fever dream, but an actual human being, a real person, the first she'd seen in 3 days of dying alone. The voice was male, deep and rough from lack of use, speaking words that sounded concerned, but she couldn't quite make sense of them through the fog in her brain. Then hands were touching her, gentle but urgent, fingers pressing against her neck checking for a pulse, other hand on her forehead feeling the fever, and Grace tried to open her eyes, tried to see who it was, some distant part of her hoping it was her father, hoping he'd come back, hoping he'd realized his mistake and returned to save her. But it wasn't her father. Through blurred vision and fever haze, Grace saw a man she'd never met before, Asian features, maybe in his 50s, with gray-streaked black hair pulled back in a ponytail and a thick beard that was more gray than black, wearing worn outdoor clothing that looked like it had seen years of mountain weather. His eyes were dark and kind and deeply sad, the eyes of someone who'd seen more loss than any person should have to bear, and when he looked at her, really looked at her, she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen in a long time. She saw someone who cared that she was dying, someone who was horrified by her condition, someone who looked at a dying child and felt like it mattered. Marcus Chen had been hiking his monthly supply trail, the 40-mile round trip he made to the nearest town for food and necessities, the only time he left his isolated cabin and rejoined human society even briefly. He'd been living in these mountains for 12 years, ever since the accident that took his wife and 7-year-old daughter, ever since he'd walked away from his successful medical practice, and everything else that reminded him of the life he'd lost. He came to the mountains to disappear, to exist without the constant reminder of what he'd failed to save, to live in the kind of solitude that felt like the only honest response to the kind of pain that never healed. He knew these trails better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, had walked them in every season and every weather, and he'd never once found another human being this far from civilization. The nearest hiking trail was 15 miles away. No one came out here. No one had any reason to. So when he'd seen the small form curled in the shallow cave, his first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer that had died, maybe something the wolves had killed and partially eaten. But something made him look closer, made him approach when every instinct said to keep walking, to not get involved, to maintain the isolation he built so carefully. And when he realized it was a child, a little girl barely breathing, covered in dirt and blood and clearly dying, something in him that he thought had died 12 years ago came roaring back to life. The doctor in him, the father in him, the part of him that had chosen medicine because he believed in fighting death, even when death seemed inevitable. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands moving with a speed and precision that came from decades of training and experience, checking her pulse, which was thready and irregular, checking her breathing, which was shallow and labored, checking her pupils, which were responsive but sluggish, checking her skin, which was burning with fever and gray with dehydration. His mind catalogued her condition with clinical detachment, even as his heart broke at seeing a child in this state. Severe dehydration, at least 72 hours without adequate water. Malnutrition, multiple days without food. Exposure, torn clothing and scrapes suggesting she'd been out here alone and struggling. Fever indicating infection or underlying condition. Pulse irregularity, suggesting cardiac involvement. This child was in critical condition, maybe an hour from death, maybe less, and she was miles from any hospital or help. Marcus made a decision in that moment that would change both their lives, though he didn't know it then. He couldn't leave her, couldn't walk away, even though getting involved meant complications and questions, and possibly legal trouble for not reporting found child immediately. Because before he was a hermit, before he was a broken man hiding from the world, he'd been a doctor, and doctors don't walk past dying children no matter how much it might hurt to try to save them. He pulled off his heavy jacket and wrapped it around her small body, then carefully, so carefully, lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, this tiny fragile girl who should have been safe at home, not dying alone in the wilderness. And as he stood with her cradled against his chest, he felt rage building in him for whoever had allowed this to happen, rage that quickly turned to determination because rage wouldn't save her but his skills might. The walk back to his cabin took 45 minutes that felt like hours, Marcus moving as fast as he could while being careful not to jostle her too much, his arms burning from holding her weight even though she was so light, his mind racing through treatment protocols and calculating what supplies he had and what he'd need. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whimpering, sometimes crying out words he couldn't quite catch, once opening her eyes and staring at him with such naked fear and confusion that he found himself talking to her in a low, steady voice, telling her she was safe now, telling her he was a doctor, telling her he was going to help her, even though he had no idea if she could hear him or understand. His cabin appeared through the trees, rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney, small and weathered but solid, built to withstand mountain winters and the isolation Marcus had sought. He kicked open the door and carried the girl inside, laying her carefully on his bed, the only real bed in the one-room structure, while his mind shifted fully into doctor mode, that place where emotion got pushed aside and training took over. He started with the immediate threats to her life, the things that would kill her in the next few hours if he didn't address them. Dehydration first. He set up in 4-line with practiced efficiency, his supplies limited but adequate for basic medical care because he'd kept that much from his old life, the ability to treat himself if he got injured in his isolation. The 4 went into her arm on the second try. Her veins collapsed from dehydration, making it harder than it should have been, and he started fluids running slowly, carefully, because too fast could cause more problems. Next was the fever, which was dangerously high, high enough to cause brain damage if he didn't get it down. He stripped off her dirty, torn clothes, trying to be clinical and respectful even though she was unconscious, trying not to think about his own daughter who would have been close to this girl's age if she'd lived, trying to focus on medicine instead of memory. He used cool water and cloths to bring the temperature down gradually, monitoring her constantly, checking her pulse and breathing in responsiveness. As he worked, he noticed other things. The expensive clothes she'd been wearing, now ruined but clearly high quality. The gold locket around her neck with a photo inside of a beautiful black woman who must have been her mother. The way her fingernails were clean and manicured under the dirt, suggesting she came from wealth. The small backpack near where he'd found her, containing a change of clothes, a book, and most tellingly, prescription medication bottles with a name on them. Grace Monroe. Amlodipine, digoxin, furosemide. Heart medication. Serious heart medication. This child had a significant cardiac condition that required daily medication to manage, and she'd been without it for at least 3 days. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized the full scope of what he was dealing with. This wasn't just exposure and dehydration. This was a child with a chronic heart condition in acute crisis, and he was 40 miles from the nearest hospital through mountain passes that were barely roads, and he didn't have a vehicle, didn't even have a phone since he'd deliberately chosen this location specifically because it was beyond cell service. He looked at the medication bottles, doing mental calculations. The prescriptions were recent, filled 2 weeks ago, suggesting she had access to regular medical care. She was well-dressed and well-fed before this happened, suggesting a stable home. But somehow she'd ended up alone in the mountains, critically ill, with nothing but a backpack. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a kid who wandered off from a camping trip. This was something else, something that made his medical instincts scream that things were very, very wrong. Grace stirred on the bed, her eyes moving rapidly under closed lids, her lips moving soundlessly. Then she started talking, her voice weak and slurred with fever but distinct enough that Marcus could make out the words. "Daddy, please come back. I'm sorry. I'll be good. Please don't leave me. Mommy, where are you? It's cold. So cold. Daddy, please. I promise I'll be good. Don't leave me to die. Please." The words came in fragments, broken pieces of whatever nightmare she was living through in her fever dreams, and with each word Marcus's fury grew, because those weren't the words of a child who got lost. Those were the words of a child who was abandoned, deliberately left, thrown away like she didn't matter. He continued his work through the morning and into the afternoon, managing her 4 fluids, monitoring her heart rate, which remained irregular and concerning, trying to bring her fever down degree by degree, cleaning and bandaging her scrapes and cuts, checking the medication bottles, and trying to calculate appropriate doses for a child her size with her specific conditions. He'd been a surgeon, specializing in trauma, not a pediatric cardiologist, but he remembered enough, had retained enough knowledge that he could make educated decisions, even if they weren't perfect. Around mid-afternoon, he managed to get some liquid medication into her, coaxing her into semi-consciousness just long enough to swallow, and within an hour her heart rate started to stabilize slightly, the irregular rhythms evening out into something closer to normal, even if it was still faster than it should be. But as the day wore into evening, as Marcus sat beside the bed monitoring his young patient with the kind of focus he hadn't used in 12 years, he had to face the truth he'd been avoiding. She was stabilizing, yes. The immediate threat of death from dehydration and cardiac crisis was passing. But she wasn't out of danger. Not even close. Her condition was complex, requiring medications he didn't have, monitoring equipment he didn't possess, expertise he couldn't provide. She needed a hospital, needed specialists, needed care beyond what one former trauma surgeon could provide in an isolated cabin with limited supplies. And the nearest hospital was 40 miles away through mountain passes that would take him 2 days to walk carrying her, 2 days of rough terrain and exposure that her fragile body might not survive, 2 days during which her condition could deteriorate and she could die in his arms with nothing he could do about it. He sat there in his cabin as darkness fell, watching this child breathe, watching the rise and fall of her small chest, watching the 4 drip fluid into her veins, and he had no idea what to do. He couldn't take her to the hospital, not without a vehicle and not without killing her in the attempt. He couldn't keep her here indefinitely, not with her medical needs. But he also couldn't just send her back to wherever she came from, not when everything about her condition and her fever dreams suggested she'd been abandoned deliberately, thrown away by people who should have protected her. He was stuck, trapped between impossible choices, with a dying child depending on him and no good options anywhere in sight. Marcus Chen looked at Grace Monroe and said out loud to the empty cabin, to the girl who couldn't hear him, to the universe that had somehow brought them together, "She's not going to make it without the medication. And the nearest hospital is 40 miles away through mountain passes. If you're hoping Marcus saves her, you better subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller because we tell stories where hope matters. And if you won't subscribe, comment below and explain how you'll catch our next story without it." Now, here's what happened next. Marcus Chen sat in the darkness of his cabin for exactly 17 minutes after making that statement, watching Grace breathe, watching the four-drip, running calculations in his head that all led to the same impossible conclusion. She needed medication he didn't have. She needed it soon, within the next 12 to 24 hours, or her heart condition would spiral into crisis again, and this time he might not be able to pull her back. The nearest pharmacy was in the town 40 miles away, the same town where he made his monthly supply runs. But 40 miles there and 40 miles back was an 80-mile round trip through mountain terrain that would take him at least 2 full days of hard hiking, maybe 3 if the weather turned. 2 to 3 days of leaving this child alone in his cabin, unconscious and vulnerable, with nothing but in for keeping her alive. 2 to 3 days during which anything could go wrong, and he wouldn't be there to fix it. But the alternative was watching her die, slowly, inevitably, as her body failed without the medication it needed to function. Marcus had watched his wife and daughter die 12 years ago, had been powerless to save them when their car went off a mountain road, and he'd been thrown clear while they'd been trapped inside the burning wreckage, screaming his name, begging for help he couldn't give because his leg was shattered and he couldn't walk, and all he could do was drag himself toward them and watch them burn. He'd sworn after that day that he'd never be helpless again, that he'd never watch someone die when he had the ability to save them. And right now, he had the ability to save Grace Monroe. It would cost him exhaustion and risk and possibly his own safety, but he could do it. He had to do it. Because if he didn't, if he chose his own comfort or safety over her life, then he was no better than whoever had abandoned her in these mountains to die. He stood up with the kind of decisive movement that comes from making a choice you know is right even when it's hard, and started preparing for the journey. He filled his largest backpack with supplies, food and water for 2 days of hard travel, a sleeping bag in case he couldn't make it back the first night, rope and basic climbing gear for the rough sections of trail, a first aid kit, and money, the cash he kept hidden in his cabin for emergencies, because this was definitely an emergency. He left detailed notes beside Grace's bed, instructions for if she woke up while he was gone, telling her not to be afraid, telling her who he was, telling her where he'd gone, and that he'd be back. He adjusted her floor rate to run slower so it wouldn't empty before he returned, checked her vital signs one more time, and made sure she was as stable as he could get her. Then he did something he hadn't done in 12 years. He locked his cabin door from the outside, securing it not to keep Grace in but to keep anything else out, to protect her while she was alone and helpless. Marcus left his cabin at midnight, hiking by headlamp through darkness that was absolute and unforgiving, pushing his 52-year-old body harder than he had in years. The trail down the mountain was treacherous even in daylight, loose rocks and steep grades in sections where one wrong step would send you tumbling down slopes that ended in places you didn't want to think about. In the dark, it was exponentially more dangerous, but Marcus moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked these trails so many times he could probably do it blind. His legs burned. His lungs ached in the thin mountain air. Old injuries from the accident protested, that shattered leg that had healed but never quite right, sending spikes of pain through his hip with every step. But he pushed through it, pushed through the exhaustion and pain and the voice in his head that said this was insane, that he was risking his life for a child he didn't know, that he should just call authorities from town and let them handle it. Except he knew he couldn't do that. Couldn't turn her over to a system that would ask questions he didn't have good answers for, that would want to know why he'd waited so long to report finding her, that would probably separate them before he could explain that something was deeply wrong about how she'd ended up in those mountains. And more than that, he'd seen the fear in her fevered dreams, heard her begging not to be left, and something in him recognized that she needed more than just medical care. She needed safety. She needed someone who wouldn't abandon her. And for reasons he didn't fully understand and wasn't ready to examine, he wanted to be that person. He reached the town by late afternoon of the first day, his body screaming with exhaustion, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the mountain cold. The town was small, maybe 3,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed. Marcus kept his head down and moved quickly, going straight to the pharmacy with Grace's empty medication bottles and the prescriptions he'd found in her backpack. The pharmacist was a woman in her 60s who looked at him over her glasses with suspicion, asking questions about whose prescriptions these were, why he had them, where the patient was. Marcus had prepared his story during the hike, had crafted a lie that was close enough to truth to be believable. His niece, he said, visiting from the city. They'd been hiking and forgotten her medication. She was back at his place, couldn't make the trip into town because she wasn't feeling well. Yes, he had identification. Yes, he could pay. Yes, he understood these were serious medications and needed to be taken exactly as prescribed. The pharmacist studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing whether to believe him or call the authorities. But something in his face, maybe the exhaustion or the desperation or the obvious concern, must have convinced her because she nodded and started filling the prescriptions, lecturing him about responsibility, and making sure his niece had adequate medication supplies when visiting remote areas. Marcus nodded and agreed to everything, paid in cash, took the white paper bags with their precious cargo, and left before she could change her mind or ask more questions. He bought more supplies, food that would keep, bottled water, basic first aid materials, and started the return journey immediately, even though his body begged for rest, even though every muscle protested, because every hour he was gone was an hour Grace was alone. The hike back was harder than the hike down, climbing elevation he'd lost, his body running on nothing but determination and the fear of what he might find when he returned. He pushed through the night again, refusing to stop, refusing to sleep, driven by images of Grace waking up alone and terrified, or worse, not waking up at all, her condition deteriorating while he was too far away to help. He reached his cabin just after dawn on the second day, having made the 80-mile round trip in 36 hours, a pace that should have been impossible but wasn't when a child's life depended on it. His hands were shaking so badly from exhaustion he could barely unlock his door, and when he stumbled inside, he found Grace exactly as he'd left her, still unconscious, still breathing, still alive. The relief that hit him was so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. But Grace wasn't exactly as he'd left her. As Marcus moved closer, he realized her eyes were open, had been open, watching him from the bed with an expression that was half fear and half something else, something calculating and aware. She'd been awake, maybe for hours, maybe since sometime during the night, and she'd been waiting to see if he would come back, if he was real or another fever dream, if she could trust the man who'd saved her or if he was just another adult who would hurt her. Her hand was clutched around something, and when Marcus looked closer, he saw it was one of his old medical journals, the ones he'd kept from his previous life, the ones with his name printed on the cover along with his credentials. Dr. Marcus Chen, Chief of Trauma Surgery, Metropolitan Hospital. She'd found them. She'd explored his cabin while he was gone, had looked through his things, had discovered who he used to be. Marcus set down his backpack carefully and approached the bed slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. "You're awake," he said quietly, his voice rough from exhaustion and dehydration. "That's good. That's very good. How do you feel?" Grace stared at him without speaking, her dark eyes huge in her thin face, still too pale, still too fragile, but more alert than she'd been. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again, and finally managed to whisper, "Who are you? Why did you save me?" Her voice was small and hoarse, damaged from days of crying and screaming in the mountains, but there was strength underneath it, a core of steel that had kept her alive when she should have died. Marcus pulled over his single chair and sat down, maintaining distance between them, keeping his posture open and non-threatening. "My name is Marcus Chen. I found you 3 days ago, dying in a cave about 6 miles from here. I'm a doctor, or I was, and I couldn't leave you there. So I brought you here, to my cabin, and I've been treating you. You were very sick, Grace. You still are. But I went to town and got your medications, and with those you're going to be okay." He pulled the pharmacy bags from his backpack and set them on the small table beside the bed, watching her eyes track the familiar bottles with something that looked like hope mixed with confusion. "How do you know my name?" Grace asked, her fingers tightening on the medical journal. "How did you know what medicine I need?" Marcus gestured toward her backpack, which sat in the corner where he'd left it. Your backpack had your prescription bottles. Your name was on them. Grace Monroe, 8 years old. Congenital heart condition requiring daily medication. I'm sorry I went through your things, but I needed to know what I was dealing with to treat you properly. He paused, watching her process this information, seeing the wheels turning in her young mind, calculating, evaluating, trying to figure out if she was safe or in a different kind of danger. You were a famous doctor, Grace said, her eyes dropping to the journal in her hands. It says here you did a surgery on a senator that no one else could do. It says you saved hundreds of people. Why are you living in the mountains alone? The question was blunt, the kind of directness children have before they learn to hide behind politeness. And Marcus felt something in his chest tighten because of course she would ask that. Of course she would find the discrepancy between who he'd been and who he was now. He was quiet for a long moment, deciding how much truth to give her, how much a traumatized 8-year-old could handle. Then he decided that she'd already survived the worst truth possible, that her father had tried to kill her, so maybe she could handle his truth too. I had a family once, he said softly. A wife named Sarah and a daughter named Lily. She was 7 when it happened, about your age. We were driving in the mountains, going on vacation, and there was an accident. The car went off the road. I survived. They didn't. I was a trauma surgeon, one of the best in the country, and I couldn't save my own family. After that, I couldn't go back to the hospital, couldn't keep saving other people when I had failed to save the ones who mattered most. So I came here, to the mountains, to live alone where I didn't have to face anyone or answer questions or pretend I was okay when I wasn't. Grace absorbed this in silence, her expression unreadable, and Marcus wondered what she was thinking, whether she understood the weight of what he'd shared. Then she said something that stopped his heart. My mommy died too. 6 months ago. Brain thing. She was there and then she wasn't. And my daddy stopped loving me after that. He said I reminded him too much of her. He said I cost too much money to keep alive, so he brought me to the mountains and left me there to die. He said it was easier for everyone. Her voice was flat, emotionless, the way children sound when they're talking about trauma too big to process, stating facts that should destroy them with the same tone you'd use to describe the weather. Marcus felt rage building in him again, hot and righteous, the kind of anger that comes from seeing a child hurt deliberately by the people who should protect them. But beneath the rage was something else, a connection, a recognition. They were the same, he and this little girl, both of them destroyed by loss, both of them abandoned by the people who should have loved them, her father abandoning her physically, his family abandoning him through death. Both of them alone and broken, and trying to survive in the ruins of lives that should have been different. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. Grace, I need to ask you something important. Do you have any other family? Grandparents, aunts, uncles, anyone who would be looking for you? Grace shook her head slowly. Mommy didn't have family. Daddy's family doesn't talk to us. There's just Daddy and Victoria and James, and they don't want me. No one wants me. I'm too expensive, and I remind people of Mommy, and I'm going to die anyway, so what's the point? She said it matter-of-factly, repeating words she'd clearly heard, words that had been driven into her like nails until she believed them. Marcus felt something break inside him, felt that wall he'd built around himself 12 years ago crack wide open, felt emotions he'd been trying to avoid come flooding back with a force that was almost physical. Listen to me very carefully, he said, and there was intensity in his voice that made Grace look directly at him, really see him. You are not too expensive. You are not a burden. And you are not going to die, not if I have anything to say about it. What your father did was wrong, Grace. It was criminal and cruel and unforgivable. You didn't deserve that. No child deserves that. And I don't know exactly what we're going to do going forward, but I know this. You're not going back to him. You're not going back to anyone who would hurt you like that. Grace's eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion she'd shown since waking up. But where will I go? What happens to me? Marcus stood up and crossed to the window, looking out at the mountains that had been his prison and his refuge for 12 years, thinking about the choice in front of him, the choice that would change everything. He could take her to authorities, let the system handle it, wash his hands of responsibility, and go back to his isolation. That was the safe choice, the reasonable choice, the choice that wouldn't bind him to another person who could be taken away. Or he could do something insane and beautiful and terrifying. He could keep her. Not legally, not officially, not in any way that would hold up to scrutiny. But he could keep her alive, keep her safe, teach her what he knew, give her the chance her father had tried to steal. He could choose to stop hiding from life and start living it again, even if living meant risking the kind of pain he'd been avoiding for 12 years. He turned back to face her, and she was watching him with those huge dark eyes, waiting for his answer, waiting to see if he was going to be one more adult who failed her. "I made some calls from town," he said slowly, which was partly true because he'd stopped at a payphone and called an old colleague who still owed him favors. "I checked missing person reports, asked some very quiet questions. No one has reported you missing, Grace. Your father hasn't filed a report. The police aren't looking for you. As far as the official world is concerned, you don't exist out here. He's probably claiming you ran away, or maybe that you were visiting relatives, or some other story that covers his tracks. Rich men like your father are very good at making problems disappear." Grace's face crumpled slightly, a flash of pain at the confirmation that her father had erased her so completely, so efficiently. But Marcus kept talking, his voice gaining strength as the decision solidified in his mind. "If I take you to authorities now, they're going to ask questions. They're going to investigate. And maybe they'll figure out what your father did, or maybe he'll convince them of whatever story he's telling, and you'll end up in the foster system while they sort it out. Maybe you'll find a good family, or maybe you'll bounce around between homes that don't want you, getting sicker because your medication gets mismanaged, losing years of your life to a system that's overwhelmed and underfunded and doesn't have the resources to give you what you need." He crossed back to the bed and sat down again, closer this time, and Grace didn't flinch away. "Or," he said quietly, "you could stay here. With me. I can manage your condition. I have the medical knowledge even if I don't have the fancy equipment. I can teach you, homeschool you, make sure you get an education that prepares you for whatever you want to do with your life. I can keep you safe and hidden until you're old enough and strong enough to decide for yourself what you want to do, whether you want to confront your father or just disappear and build a new life where he can't touch you. It won't be easy, Grace. Living out here is hard. The winters are brutal. We'll be isolated from everything. But you'll be alive. You'll be safe. And you'll be wanted, which is more than your father gave you." Grace stared at him for a long time, searching his face for deception or ulterior motives or any of 1,000 ways adults hurt children. But whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly, then asked in a small voice, "Why would you do that? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. Why would you risk everything to help me?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd suppressed for 12 years, felt tears threatening that he refused to let fall because he needed to be strong for her, needed to be what she needed. "Because I couldn't save my daughter," he said honestly. "But maybe I can save you. And maybe, just maybe, saving you will save me too. We're both broken, Grace. We've both lost everything that mattered. But broken things can be mended if they're handled carefully enough. I can't replace what you lost. Your mother is gone. Your father destroyed whatever love might have existed there. I can't give you back your family, or your old life, or anything that was taken from you. But I can teach you to survive, and maybe one day to thrive. If this moment is hitting you in the chest, if you're thinking about second chances and the people who saved you when you needed it most, then subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller right now. Because we tell stories about survival and redemption, and the families we choose when the families we're born in to fail us. Hit that button. And if you won't, come to the comments and tell me why stories about hope don't matter to you. I want to understand. Now let me show you what happened when two broken people decided to build something beautiful from the ruins of their lives. The first winter nearly killed them both, not from cold or starvation, but from the sheer difficulty of two broken people learning to live together when neither had planned for it. Grace was still weak, her body recovering slowly from the trauma of abandonment and near death, her heart requiring careful monitoring and strict medication schedules that Marcus maintained with the precision of someone who understood that one missed dose could spiral into crisis. She had nightmares every night, waking up screaming that her father was driving away, that she was alone in the dark with wolves circling, that no one was coming to save her. Marcus would sit beside her bed in those moments, speaking in low, steady tones until her breathing calmed, until she remembered where she was, until the fear receded enough for her to sleep again. He didn't tell her that he had nightmares too, that he still dreamed of fire and screaming and being unable to save the people he loved most. Some pain was too private to share, even with someone who understood it. But slowly, day by day, Grace got stronger. Her color returned first, that gray pallor of near death replaced by the warm brown of healthy skin. Her breathing eased as her medication regulated her heart function. She started eating more, her appetite returning as her body demanded fuel for healing. And with physical strength came curiosity, that natural drive children have to understand the world around them, to learn and grow and figure out how things work. She started exploring the cabin more thoroughly, asking questions about everything she saw. What were all these books? Why did Marcus have medical equipment? How did the wood stove work? Where did water come from? What animals lived in these mountains? How did you survive winter? The questions came in an endless stream, and Marcus found himself answering them, found himself teaching her, found himself rediscovering the joy of sharing knowledge with someone hungry to learn. He started with basics, because Grace's formal education had been interrupted by her mother's death and the chaos that followed. She could read well for her age. Her mother had made sure of that, but her math was shaky and her science education was almost non-existent beyond what 8-year-olds typically learned in school. Marcus created a curriculum from the books he had, which were mostly medical texts and reference materials, but also included some classic literature, history books, and the kind of general knowledge volumes that educated people accumulated. He taught her mathematics by having her calculate medication doses, teaching her that if she took 0.25 milligrams per kilogram of body weight and she weighed 23 kilograms, how much medication did she need? She learned fractions by measuring ingredients for bread. She learned geometry by understanding the angles of the cabin's roof and why it was built that way to shed snow. She learned chemistry through understanding how her medications worked, what they did to her body at a molecular level, why certain combinations were dangerous and others were necessary. But Marcus's real gift to Grace was teaching her medicine itself, not as something that would be done to her, but as something she could understand and eventually master. He showed her anatomy books, explaining in terms she could grasp how her heart worked, why her specific condition made it struggle, what the medications did to help. He let her listen to her own heartbeat through his stethoscope, let her feel her pulse and count the beats, let her understand her body as something she had agency over rather than something that was failing her. And Grace was fascinated, absolutely captivated by the complexity of human biology, by the elegance of how systems work together, by the challenge of figuring out what was wrong and how to fix it. She started reading his medical journals, the old ones from his trauma surgery days, asking him to explain terms she didn't understand, pushing him to teach her more, always more, never satisfied with surface knowledge. By the time Grace was 10 years old, she could identify every major bone in the human body, describe the function of each organ system, explain the cardiac cycle in detail that would impress most medical students, and perform basic first aid better than most adults. She could suture a wound on a piece of leather Marcus provided for practice, her small hands surprisingly steady, her stitches neat and even. She could read an EKG strip and identify basic arrhythmias. She could calculate drug dosages in her head faster than Marcus could write them down. She was, Marcus realized, was something between pride and amazement, exceptionally gifted. Not just smart, but brilliant, with the kind of natural aptitude for medicine that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. And nurturing her became his purpose, the thing that got him out of bed in the morning, the reason he'd stopped just existing and started living again. But Grace's education wasn't only academic. Marcus also taught her survival, the practical skills she'd need living in isolation from the world. She learned to chop wood without losing fingers, to build and maintain fires that would burn all night in winter, to purify water from mountain streams, to identify edible plants and which berries would feed you and which would kill you. She learned to read weather patterns in the sky, to predict storms before they arrived, to know when it was safe to hike and when staying inside meant the difference between life and death. She learned to track animals, to move quietly through forest, to observe without being observed. She learned self-sufficiency in ways that most children never would, skills that made her capable and confident in an environment that would terrify most adults. The years passed in a rhythm dictated by seasons and study. Winters were harsh. Months of snow and cold where they stayed inside for days at a time, reading by lamplight, Marcus teaching while wind howled outside and snow piled higher than the windows. Grace would study medicine in the morning, mathematics and science in the afternoon, literature and history in the evening, her mind soaking up knowledge like a sponge that had been starved for water. Spring meant emergence from the cabin, checking supplies, beginning the garden Marcus had planted years ago that now fed them through summer and fall. Grace learned to cultivate soil, to plant seeds, to nurture growing things with the same care Marcus had nurtured her. Summer was for long hikes, for exploring the mountains, for physical conditioning that kept Grace's body strong despite her heart condition. Marcus taught her to climb, to navigate by stars and sun, to cover vast distances efficiently. Fall was for harvest and preparation, for gathering and preserving food, for splitting wood and making sure they had everything needed to survive another winter. And through it all, Grace grew. She shot up in height, losing that small, fragile look of her 8-year-old self, becoming lean and strong from mountain life and good nutrition and the kind of physical work that built muscle and endurance. Her face lost its childish roundness, her features sharpening into beauty that reminded Marcus of the photo in her locket, the mother she'd lost. But it was her eyes that changed most, those dark eyes that had been full of fear and betrayal at 8 becoming sharp and observant and determined by 12, by 15, by 17. She never forgot what had been done to her. Never forgot her father driving away, leaving her to die. Never forgot Victoria's cold satisfaction or James's confused face in the window. Those memories were etched into her like scars, and rather than trying to forget them, Grace used them as fuel. She would survive not just despite her abandonment, but because of it. She would become so exceptional, so undeniably brilliant, so impossible to ignore that her father would one day know exactly what he'd thrown away. By the time Grace was 14, she was reading medical journals at a college level, debating diagnosis and treatment protocols with Marcus like they were colleagues rather than teacher and student. She'd absorbed everything he could teach her about trauma surgery, about emergency medicine, about the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. But she wanted more, needed more, and Marcus knew that his cabin and his books and his knowledge had limitations. She needed formal education, needed to interact with other people, needed to test herself against the wider world she'd been hidden from for 6 years. But he was terrified of letting her go, terrified that sending her back into civilization would mean losing her to the system that would ask questions about who she was and where she'd been, and why a 58-year-old hermit had a teenage girl living with him in the mountains. They had the conversation on her 15th birthday, sitting outside the cabin watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple and gold. Grace had been quiet all day, thoughtful in a way that meant she was wrestling with something important. Finally, she said without preamble, "I want to take the GED. I want to apply to college. I want to become a doctor, a real one, with credentials and the ability to practice medicine legally. I want everything you gave up, and I want to be so good at it that I make you proud." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion that he'd gotten better at expressing but still struggled with. He looked at this girl who'd become like a daughter to him, who'd saved him as much as he'd saved her, and said honestly, "You already make me proud, Grace. Every single day." The logistics were complicated, but Marcus had money saved from his previous life, investments that had been sitting untouched for years, enough to make things happen if he was willing to come out of hiding enough to access them. He made trips to town, longer trips to the city, setting up what Grace would need. He found a lawyer who asked minimal questions and helped establish a legal identity for Grace that would hold up to scrutiny, creating a backstory that was close enough to truth to be believable. Homeschooled by her uncle after her parents died, medical condition that required isolation from typical school environment, exceptional student applying for early testing. Grace took the GED at 16 and scored in the 99th percentile in every subject. She took college entrance exams and her scores were so high that the testing center flagged them for review, suspecting cheating, until she retook them under observation and scored even higher. Universities started sending recruitment letters, full scholarships, offers of admission to pre-med programs, promises of opportunity. Grace read them all with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, evaluating options with the analytical mind Marcus had helped her develop. She chose Metropolitan University, The same school where Marcus had completed his medical degree decades ago, partly for its prestigious medical program, and partly because she knew it would mean something to him. She was accepted with a full academic scholarship that covered tuition, housing, books, everything. She would start in the fall semester, moving to the city, entering a world she barely remembered, becoming part of a society she'd been hidden from for almost a decade. The months between acceptance and departure were bittersweet, filled with preparation and unspoken fear. Marcus taught her things he'd avoided teaching her before. Social skills she'd need to navigate a world very different from mountain isolation. How to interact with peers who hadn't lived through what she'd lived through. How to hide her past without lying outright. How to protect herself from people who might try to take advantage of a young woman alone in the city. How to blend in when standing out her whole life had made her who she was. Grace absorbed these lessons like she'd absorbed everything else, but Marcus could see the anxiety underneath her confidence, could see that she was terrified in ways she'd never been terrified of mountains or wolves or physical danger. The night before she was supposed to leave, Grace couldn't sleep. Marcus found her outside the cabin at 3 a.m, sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at stars that were so bright this far from cities that they looked close enough to touch. He sat beside her without speaking, giving her space to work through whatever was churning in her mind. Finally, she turned to him, and in the starlight he could see tears on her face, the first tears he'd seen from her in years. "Before I leave for university," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "I need to know something. And I need the truth, Marcus. Why didn't you send me back? When you found me, when you realized what had happened, why didn't you just turn me over to authorities and let them handle it? You could have reported my father, could have made sure I was safe without binding yourself to me. Why did you keep me? Why did you risk everything to give me this life?" Marcus was quiet for a long time, looking at the stars and the mountains and this young woman who'd become his daughter in every way that mattered, thinking about the question she deserved an honest answer to. "I told you once that I couldn't save my family," he said finally. "What I didn't tell you was that after they died, I wanted to die too. I came to these mountains planning to just fade away, to exist until I stopped existing, to disappear from a world that had taken everything that mattered. I wasn't living up here, Grace. I was waiting to die. And then I found you, this broken little girl who should have died but refused to, this child who'd been thrown away but kept fighting, and something in me recognized something in you. We were the same, you and I. Both of us destroyed by loss. Both of us abandoned. Both of us existing in the wreckage of lives that should have been different." He turned to look at her directly, wanting her to see the truth in his eyes. "I kept you because some children are meant to find the parents they deserve, not the ones they were given. Your father didn't deserve you. He was too weak, too selfish, too broken by grief to see what he had. But I saw it. I saw your strength and your brilliance and your refusal to quit even when quitting would have been easier. And I thought, maybe if I can help this child become who she's meant to be, maybe my life will have meant something after all. Maybe saving you would save me too. And it did, Grace. You saved me. You gave me purpose when I had none. You gave me hope when I thought hope was dead. You became my daughter not because of blood or law, but because we chose each other, because we were both alone, and decided to be alone together until we weren't alone anymore." Grace was crying openly now, not trying to hide it, and Marcus felt his own eyes burning with tears he'd held back for too long. She leaned against him, this young woman who'd been a dying child when he found her, and he put his arm around her shoulders the way fathers do, the way he'd done with his own daughter a lifetime ago. "I'm scared," Grace admitted quietly. "I'm scared of leaving you. I'm scared of the city and people and having to pretend I'm normal when I'm not. I'm scared I'll fail. I'm scared I'll succeed and become someone you don't recognize. I'm scared that the world out there will break me the way my father tried to break me." Marcus pulled her closer, feeling the weight of responsibility and love and fear that every parent feels when their child leaves for the wider world. "You're right to be scared," he said honestly. "The world can be cruel. People can be terrible. You're going to face discrimination and doubt, and people who won't believe you're as good as you are because of how you look or where you came from, or because you're a woman in a field dominated by men who think they're smarter than they are. You're going to have moments where you want to quit, where you think maybe your father was right, maybe you're not strong enough or smart enough or worth the effort. But Grace, listen to me. Your father was wrong about everything that mattered. You are strong enough. You are brilliant. You are worth every bit of effort and investment and belief. And you're not the same scared little girl he abandoned. You're a survivor. You're a fighter. You're someone who looked at death and said not today. And that person doesn't break. That person bends and adapts and overcomes. That person becomes extraordinary. They sat together until dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, watching the world wake up the way they'd watched it wake up 1,000 times over the past 10 years. Grace wiped her tears and stood, straightening her shoulders, setting her jaw in that determined way she had when she'd made a decision. "I'm going to make you proud," she said firmly. "I'm going to become the best doctor this country has ever seen. I'm going to prove that your faith in me wasn't misplaced. And someday, when I'm ready, I'm going to confront my father and show him exactly what he threw away. I'm going to look him in the eyes and make him understand that abandoning me was the biggest mistake of his miserable life." Marcus stood too, looking at this young woman who'd become his greatest achievement, better than any surgery he'd performed, more important than any life he'd saved in all his years of medicine. "You already make me proud," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every single day, Grace. Every single day. And whatever you become, wherever you go, whatever you do, you'll always have a home here. You'll always have me. Not because you need me, but because we chose each other, and that choice was the best decision either of us ever made." Grace left the next morning, hiking down the mountain trail with a backpack full of her few possessions and her mother's locket around her neck, the same locket she'd been wearing the day Marcus found her dying in a cave. Marcus stood outside his cabin watching until she disappeared around a bend in the trail, watching until he couldn't see her anymore. And then he went inside and sat at his table and cried for the first time since the accident that killed his family, cried because he'd found a daughter in the mountains and raised her into a woman who would change the world, cried because letting her go was both the hardest thing he'd done and the most necessary, cried because he was proud and terrified and so full of love for this child who wasn't his by blood, but was his in every way that mattered. And in that moment, sitting alone in his cabin with tears streaming down his face, Marcus Chen understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, even when every instinct screams to hold on, even when distance feels like death, even when you know that the world might hurt the person you love and you won't be there to protect them. You let go because they deserve the chance to fly, because keeping them safe means letting them risk danger, because love isn't about possession, but about giving someone the freedom to become who they're meant to be. If this father-daughter bond is hitting you right in the heart, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. We share stories of resilience and found family every single week. Not subscribing? Tell me in the comments why you'd skip stories that restore your faith in humanity. Let's see what Grace became. Grace Monroe walked into Metropolitan University at 18 years old with her mother's locket around her neck, 10 years of mountain isolation behind her, and a determination that burned so bright it was almost visible. The campus was overwhelming at first, thousands of students moving between buildings with the casual confidence of people who'd spent their whole lives in civilization, people who took for granted things like electricity and running water and cafeterias, where food appeared without anyone having to hunt or grow or preserve it. Grace had to learn to navigate crowds when she'd spent a decade seeing only one other person. She had to learn to sleep through the noise of dorms and traffic and humanity pressed together when she'd grown accustomed to silence broken only by wind and wildlife. She had to learn to interact with peers who'd never faced real hardship, who complained about grades and relationships and minor inconveniences, while Grace had survived being abandoned to die and had rebuilt herself from that trauma into something stronger than they could imagine. But if the social adjustment was hard, the academic work was almost insultingly easy. Grace had been taught by one of the best trauma surgeons in the country, had absorbed knowledge most pre-med students wouldn't encounter until their second or third year, had practical understanding of medicine that went far beyond textbook theory. She tested out of most introductory courses, placing directly into advanced classes that should have been too difficult for a freshman but felt like review to someone who'd been suturing practice wounds since age 10. Her professors noticed immediately. This young black woman who sat in the front row of every class, who asked questions that revealed deep understanding of complex concepts, who scored perfect or near perfect on every exam, who approached medicine not as a subject to memorize, but as a language she already spoke fluently. Some professors were impressed. Others were suspicious. A few were openly hostile, convinced that someone with her background, the vague story about being homeschooled by an uncle in rural isolation, couldn't possibly be this good without cheating somehow. The discrimination started subtly and escalated over her 4 years of undergraduate work. Professors who questioned her exam answers, even when they were correct, demanding she explain her reasoning in ways they never demanded from white or male students. Lab partners who assumed she didn't know what she was doing and tried to take over experiments she was already completing flawlessly. Academic advisors who suggested maybe she should consider nursing instead of medical school, maybe aim for physician assistant rather than doctor, maybe be realistic about her limitations, even as she outperformed 98% of her class. There were comments about affirmative action, whispered suggestions that she'd only been admitted to fill quotas, open doubts about whether someone from her background could handle the rigor of actual medical training. Grace absorbed it all with the same determination she'd used to survive mountains and abandonment. She didn't argue or defend herself. She just kept scoring higher, working harder, proving through sheer undeniable excellence that every doubt was baseless and every limitation they tried to place on her was fiction. By the time Grace applied to medical school, her undergraduate record was so exceptional that she received acceptance letters from every school she applied to, full scholarships from half of them, and personal recruitment calls from department heads who'd heard about this prodigy, this student who seemed to have been born understanding medicine in ways most people had to struggle years to grasp. She chose Metropolitan Medical School, the same institution where Marcus had trained decades earlier, and walked through doors that would have been closed to her father's daughter but were wide open to Marcus Chen's chosen child. Medical school was where Grace truly began to shine, where the theoretical knowledge she'd accumulated translated into practical skill that left her professors and fellow students in awe. She had steady hands, the kind of natural dexterity that you can't teach, inherited from a father she refused to acknowledge but couldn't deny. She had analytical intelligence that let her see patterns and symptoms, make connections between seemingly unrelated findings, diagnose complex conditions others missed. And she had something deeper, something that came from having her own body fail her, having survived when she should have died. She had empathy married to expertise, the ability to see patients as people rather than problems, to understand their fear and pain while remaining clinically detached enough to make the hard decisions that saved lives. It was during her second year of medical school that Grace met Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, and that meeting changed everything. Dr. Okonkwo was a legend in cardiothoracic surgery, a Nigerian immigrant who'd fought her way through every barrier the medical establishment could throw at a black woman and emerged as one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the country. She was 60 years old, with silver-streaked braids she wore in an elegant crown, reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, and a reputation for being brilliant, demanding, and absolutely intolerant of mediocrity. She taught advanced cardiac procedures, a class most medical students found terrifying because Dr. Okonkwo had standards that seemed impossible to meet and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see through flesh and bone to whatever weakness you were trying to hide. Grace loved her immediately, recognized in Dr. Okonkwo the same fierce determination that Marcus had shown, the same refusal to accept limitations, the same understanding that excellence was the only acceptable response to a world that would always underestimate you. Dr. Okonkwo noticed Grace on the first day of class, watched this young woman dissect a cadaver heart with precision that suggested years of experience rather than the limited exposure medical students typically had, listened to her explain cardiac pathology with understanding that went beyond memorization into true comprehension. After class, Dr. Okonkwo called Grace to her office, and when Grace arrived, nervous and uncertain about what the summons meant, the older woman got straight to the point in that direct way she had that wasted no time on pleasantries. She said, "Miss Monroe, you're either a prodigy or you've had training that your official record doesn't show. Which is it?" Grace made a split-second decision to trust this woman who reminded her so much of Marcus, who had that same quality of seeing what others missed, and told her an edited version of the truth. She'd been homeschooled by her uncle, a retired surgeon, who taught her medicine from childhood. She'd spent 10 years in intensive one-on-one medical training that formal education couldn't match. She'd learned not from textbooks alone, but from someone who'd lived medicine for decades and passed that living knowledge down to her. Dr. Okonkwo listened without interruption, her sharp eyes evaluating every word, every gesture, every tell that might indicate deception. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, "Your uncle was Marcus Chen." It wasn't a question. Grace's heart stopped for a moment, fear flooding through her, because if Dr. Okonkwo knew, if she made the connection, it could unravel everything, could lead to questions about who Grace really was and where she'd been, and why Marcus had kept a child hidden for a decade. But Dr. Okonkwo continued before Grace could panic fully. "I trained under Dr. Chen early in my career. He was the best trauma surgeon I ever saw, and his disappearance from medicine was a tragedy the field never recovered from. If he trained you, if he passed his knowledge to you, then you have been given a gift that most medical students would kill for. Don't waste it. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself or your abilities. The medical establishment will try to diminish you because you're young and black and female. They will question your competence at every turn. Prove them wrong. Become so undeniably excellent that they have no choice but to acknowledge you. Make Marcus Chen proud of what he created." From that moment, Dr. Okonkwo became Grace's mentor, champion, and the mother figure she'd lost when Elena died. She gave Grace opportunities other students didn't get, letting her observe surgeries that second-year students normally couldn't access, allowing her into the operating room as an observer, then as an assistant, then eventually as a junior surgeon performing procedures under supervision. She pushed Grace harder than she pushed anyone else, demanded more, accepted nothing less than perfection, but it came from belief rather than doubt, from recognition that Grace had the potential to be genuinely extraordinary if she was willing to put in the work. And Grace was willing. She spent every available hour in the hospital, studying cases, observing procedures, practicing techniques on simulation equipment until her hands knew the movements by muscle memory. She slept 4 hours a night, lived on coffee and determination, sacrificed any semblance of normal social life to become the best, because being good wasn't enough, being great wasn't enough. She needed to be exceptional, needed to be unforgettable, needed to be the doctor her father's disease would one day require. Because Grace had always known she would specialize in cardiothoracic surgery, from the moment she understood what her own heart condition was, from the moment Marcus explained how hearts worked and what could go wrong with them. It was partly practical, understanding the organ that had nearly killed her, the disease that had made her expensive enough to abandon. But it was also strategic. Hearts were complex, demanding, requiring years of additional training beyond medical school and residency. Cardiac surgeons were rare, elite, the top of the medical hierarchy. And Richard Monroe, her father, had a family history of heart disease, had spent his life eating rich food and managing stress poorly, and doing everything that increased his risk of cardiac problems. Grace had always known that someday, if she waited long enough, if she became good enough, he would need someone like her. He would need the best. And she intended to be the best, so that when that moment came, she would be the only choice, and he would have to face what he'd thrown away. Medical school became residency, brutal years of 80-hour weeks and constant responsibility, and learning to make life-or-death decisions when you were so exhausted you could barely think straight. Grace thrived in chaos that broke other residents, found that she worked better under pressure, that her mind sharpened when stakes were highest. She assisted on hundreds of cardiac procedures, from simple valve repairs to complex, multi-vessel bypasses to emergency surgeries where patients came in crashing and left alive only because of precise intervention. Her reputation grew. Attending physicians requested her specifically. Patients who'd had her on their care team had better outcomes. Other residents resented her or admired her or both. This young black woman, who seemed to have been born knowing things they were still struggling to learn, who moved through the hospital with quiet confidence that came from absolute certainty in her abilities. Dr. Okonkwo watched Grace's rise with the pride of someone who'd recognized raw talent and helped shape it into something remarkable. She pushed Grace toward cardiothoracic fellowship, the additional years of specialized training that would make her not just a surgeon, but a cardiac specialist capable of the most complex procedures. Grace applied and was accepted into the most competitive fellowship program in the country, working under masters of the field who taught her techniques most surgeons never learned, procedures so rare and difficult that only a handful of people could perform them. She learned how to repair hearts that other surgeons declared inoperable. She learned how to work with damaged valves, failing muscles, electrical systems gone haywire. She learned how to open a chest, hold a human heart in her hands, and fix what was broken with stitches smaller than human hair and precision measured in millimeters. By the time Grace completed her fellowship at 26, she was already being called a prodigy, a rising star, the future of cardiac surgery. Hospitals competed to recruit her. She chose St. Catherine's Hospital, a prestigious institution that gave her access to the most challenging cases and the freedom to innovate. At 28, she became the youngest cardiothoracic specialist on staff, the youngest in the region, one of the youngest in the country. She performed surgeries that other surgeons wouldn't attempt. She saved patients others had given up on. Her surgical outcomes were better than doctors, twice her age with decades more experience. The medical journals started publishing her research. Conference organizers invited her to speak. She was becoming exactly what she'd promised Marcus she'd become. Extraordinary. Undeniable. The best. Marcus came to her medical school graduation, the one time he'd left his mountain isolation for more than a supply run in 18 years. Grace hadn't known he was coming, had assumed he wouldn't be able to face the crowds and questions and the world he'd left behind. But when she walked across that stage to receive her doctorate, wearing the white coat she'd earned, becoming Dr. Grace Monroe officially and legally, and in every way that mattered, she looked into the audience and saw him standing in the back, tears streaming down his weathered face, pride radiating from him so powerfully she could feel it even from a distance. After the ceremony, they found each other in the chaos of celebrating families, and Marcus hugged her tightly, this man who'd saved her life and given her purpose, who'd become her real father in every way that mattered. He whispered in her ear, "Your mother would be so proud. I'm so proud. You did it, Grace. You became everything you promised and more." Grace held on to him and felt something in her chest unlock, some final piece of healing that came from knowing she'd succeeded not just for herself but for him, for the man who believed in her when no one else did, who'd seen potential in a dying child and nurtured it into brilliance. But Marcus saw something else in Grace, too, something that worried him even as he celebrated her achievement. He saw the way her jaw set when she talked about her career goals, the way her eyes went cold when conversation touched on wealthy families or parental abandonment, the way she watched the world with the intensity of someone waiting for something specific to happen. He pulled her aside before he left to return to his mountain, away from the other graduates and their families, and said quietly, "Grace, I'm proud of everything you've become. But I need you to promise me something. Don't let revenge consume you. Don't let anger at your father turn you into something you're not. You've built this beautiful life, this meaningful career helping people. Don't throw it away for the satisfaction of making him suffer." Grace looked at the man who knew her better than anyone and smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. "I'm not going to throw anything away," she said calmly. "I'm a doctor. I save lives. That's what I do. That's what I'll always do, even if the life I'm saving belongs to someone who doesn't deserve it." 3 months after that conversation, Grace was in the hospital cafeteria on her lunch break, grabbing terrible coffee and a sandwich she'd eat while reviewing patient charts, when she glanced at the newspaper someone had left on a table. The headline in the business section caught her eye. "Billionaire Richard Monroe seeks rare heart specialist for life-threatening condition." She picked up the paper with hands that stayed completely steady, reading the article with clinical detachment that masked the way her pulse accelerated, the way her breath caught, the way 20 years of waiting crystallized into this single moment. The article explained that Richard Monroe, 65, real estate magnate and private equity investor, was suffering from severe aortic valve disease, a condition requiring complex surgery that only a handful of specialists in the country could perform. He was seeking the best care money could buy, would travel anywhere, would pay anything, was desperate to find someone capable of saving his life. Grace read the article 3 times, memorizing every detail, the clinical description of his condition, the mentions of his family including his wife Victoria and son James, the photo of Richard looking older and grayer but still unmistakably the man who'd driven away from a clearing 20 years ago, leaving his daughter to die. She felt nothing looking at his face, No anger or pain or even satisfaction, just cold clinical assessment of a patient she would eventually treat. She folded the newspaper carefully, put it in her bag, and went back to work, completing her rounds with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. But in the back of her mind, she was already preparing, already planning, already knowing with absolute certainty that Richard Monroe would end up at St. Catherine's Hospital, would end up in her care, would end up lying in a bed looking up at the daughter he'd abandoned and realizing exactly what he'd done. 2 weeks later, Dr. Okonkwo called Grace into her office with the kind of urgency that meant something important had happened. Grace arrived to find her mentor looking at a patient file, her expression serious and complicated in ways Grace couldn't quite read. Dr. Okonkwo gestured for Grace to sit and slid the file across her desk without preamble. We have a new patient transfer requesting our cardiac unit. Aortic valve disease with severe regurgitation and stenosis. Complex case. High risk. Requires the kind of surgical precision that maybe 5 people in the country can provide. I'm assigning it to you, Grace. You're the only one here qualified to perform this procedure, and frankly, you're probably better at it than I am at this point. The surgery needs to happen within 2 weeks, or the patient will die. She paused, her eyes searching Grace's face with an intensity that suggested she knew more than she was saying. The patient's name is Richard Monroe. Does that name mean anything to you? Grace opened the file with hands that didn't shake, looked at the medical information and patient history and the photo attached to the intake forms, looked at the face of her father aged by 20 years and weakened by disease, and felt something settle into place in her chest, something that had been waiting 20 years to happen. She looked up at Dr. Okonkwo and said calmly, clearly, with absolute certainty, "That's my case. I'm the only one qualified." Then she added, because her mentor deserved honesty, because the woman who championed her deserved truth. And yes, that name means something to me. Richard Monroe is my biological father. The one who abandoned me in the mountains when I was 8 years old and left me to die because I was too expensive and reminded him too much of my mother. I know, Dr. Okonkwo. I've been waiting for this moment for 10 years. The silence that followed was heavy with implications, with questions about ethics and conflict of interest and whether Grace could maintain professional objectivity when treating someone who tried to kill her. Dr. Okonkwo studied Grace for a long moment, and Grace met her gaze steadily, letting her mentor see the determination, the control, the absolute certainty that she would do what needed to be done. Finally, Dr. Okonkwo leaned back in her chair and said quietly, "This is your decision, Grace. I can reassign the case if you think treating your father is more than you can handle professionally. But I've watched you for years now, watched you save people who didn't deserve saving, watched you maintain perfect ethics, even when it would have been easier to let nature take its course. If you tell me you can treat this man as a patient rather than as the father who wronged you, I'll believe you. But you need to be absolutely certain, because one wrong decision in that operating room could end both your career and his life." Grace stood up, taking the file with her, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the weight of choice and consequence and 20 years of survival that had led to this exact moment. "I can handle it," she said, and her voice was steady, professional, the voice of a doctor rather than a daughter. "I'll treat Richard Monroe the same way I treat every patient, with competence, with ethics, with the singular goal of saving his life regardless of what he deserves. Because that's what doctors do. That's what Marcus taught me. We save lives even when those lives belong to people who've done terrible things, because medicine isn't about judgment, it's about healing. And I'm going to save my father's life, Dr. Okonkwo. Not because he deserves it, but because I do. Because I deserve to look him in the eye and show him that he was wrong about everything, that I survived, that I thrived, that abandoning me was the biggest mistake he ever made. I'm going to save him, and then I'm going to make him live with that. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, if you can feel this confrontation building like a storm about to break, then you need to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller immediately. We bring stories where justice isn't simple, where strength is earned through suffering, where the tables turn in ways that make you believe in karma. Hit that subscribe button because you cannot miss what happens when Grace walks into Richard Monroe's hospital room. And if you won't subscribe, come to the comments and explain to me how you're going to find out what happens next when this video disappears into the algorithm. I'm reading every comment. Now let's see what happened when the daughter he left to die became the only person who could save his life. Grace walked into Richard Monroe's hospital room at exactly 8 in the morning, carrying his chart and wearing the white coat that represented everything she'd become, everything he tried to prevent her from being. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing his medical records in detail, studying the progression of his disease with the clinical detachment of a surgeon evaluating a challenging case. His aortic valve had deteriorated significantly, the regurgitation severe enough that his heart was working 3 times harder than it should just to pump blood through his body. The stenosis meant that even working that hard, his heart couldn't deliver adequate oxygen to his tissues. Without surgical intervention within 2 weeks, his heart would simply give out, probably while he was sleeping, probably without much warning. It would be a relatively peaceful death for a man who deserved far worse. But Grace wasn't interested in what he deserved. She was interested in what she deserved, which was the opportunity to look him in the eyes and show him the magnitude of his failure. Richard was awake when she entered, propped up in bed with oxygen running through a nasal cannula, his skin carrying that grayish tint that comes from chronic oxygen deprivation, his hands trembling slightly from the effort his body was making just to stay alive. He looked up when she walked in, and she watched recognition hit him like a physical blow, watched his monitor start beeping faster as his damaged heart tried to accelerate, watched color drain from his already pale face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, just a gasping sound that might have been her name, or might have been a prayer, or might have been the beginning of an apology 20 years too late. Grace said nothing, just stood at the foot of his bed looking at him with the same clinical observation she'd use on any patient, noting his vital signs, his level of distress, the way his hands clutched the sheets like he was afraid she'd disappear if he didn't hold onto something solid. The moment stretched between them, heavy with 2 decades of absence and consequence, and Grace let it stretch, let him sit in his fear and recognition, let him understand that she held all the power now and he had none. Then she spoke, her voice calm and professional, and carrying none of the emotion churning beneath her surface. "Mr. Monroe, I'm Dr. Grace Monroe, cardiothoracic specialist. I've been assigned to your case. Your condition is critical but operable. I've reviewed your films and your history, and I believe I can perform the surgery you need with a high probability of success. However, before we proceed, I need to conduct a full examination and discuss your surgical options in detail. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Richard's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to force out words that came in a hoarse whisper. "Grace. My God. Grace, you're alive. You're here. You're a doctor. I don't understand. How did you survive? Where have you been? I thought you were dead. I thought." He trailed off, clearly unable to finish that sentence, unable to say out loud that he'd left her to die and assumed the job was done. Grace's expression didn't change, didn't soften, gave him nothing except professional courtesy, as cold and sterile as the hospital room they stood in. "We'll have time to discuss my history later, Mr. Monroe. Right now, we need to focus on your immediate medical needs. Your aortic valve is failing, and without surgical intervention, you have perhaps 10 days before fatal cardiac arrest. The surgery is complex and high risk, but I've performed it successfully dozens of times. Your age and the progression of your disease make you a higher risk patient than I'd prefer, but you're still within the parameters where I'm comfortable operating. I'll need to run some additional tests this morning, and then we'll schedule the procedure for later this week. Do you have any questions about the medical aspects of your care?" The door to the hospital room opened before Richard could respond, and a woman walked in with the kind of imperious confidence that comes from wealth and the assumption that rules don't apply to people like her. Victoria Monroe looked exactly like Grace remembered, except older, her perfect blonde hair now colored to hide gray, her face showing the kind of tightness that comes from expensive cosmetic work, her designer clothes and jewelry announcing her status to anyone who might not immediately recognize it. She barely glanced at Grace, clearly assuming she was just another hospital employee, another person whose job was to serve people like the Monroes. Victoria swept past Grace without acknowledgement and moved directly to Richard's bedside, her voice sharp with the kind of irritation people use when inconvenience has interrupted their plans. "Richard, what is taking so long? I've been waiting downstairs for 20 minutes. When is the specialist supposed to arrive? I was promised the best cardiac surgeon in the region, and I expect that doctor to explain exactly what's happening and when you'll be well enough to return home. We have the charity gala in 3 weeks, and I've already sent the invitations." Grace watched this performance with detached interest, watched Victoria fuss over Richard with the kind of concern that was more about social inconvenience than actual care, watched the woman who'd helped orchestrate her abandonment treat her husband's life-threatening illness as primarily a scheduling problem. Richard's eyes were fixed on Grace, his expression pleading for something she couldn't identify, maybe mercy, maybe silence, maybe just acknowledgement that this situation was as surreal as it felt. But before Grace could speak, before she could introduce herself properly, and watch Victoria's face when she realized who the doctor in the room actually was, the door opened again and a young man walked in. And Grace felt something twist in her chest because she recognized him immediately, even though he'd aged from 6 to 26, even though the round-faced little boy had become a tall, professionally dressed man who carried himself with the casual privilege of someone who'd never worried about survival. James Monroe looked at Grace with an expression that was harder to read than his mother's dismissive arrogance or his father's horrified recognition. There was something in his eyes, some flicker of memory or unease, like he was looking at a photograph he'd seen before but couldn't quite place. He nodded politely to Grace and moved to his father's other side, putting his hand on Richard's shoulder with what looked like genuine concern. "Dad, how are you feeling?" "The doctors downstairs said your condition is worse than they initially thought. Mom's been frantic. We've been trying to find the best cardiac surgeon in the country, someone who's done this procedure hundreds of times successfully. Is that person here yet? When do we get to meet them?" Victoria turned to Grace then, really looked at her for the first time, and her voice carried that particular tone wealthy white women use when addressing service workers they consider beneath them. "Excuse me, nurse, could you please track down the cardiac specialist? We've been waiting quite long enough, and my husband's time is valuable even if yours isn't. If this hospital can't provide adequate care promptly, we'll transfer him somewhere that can." Grace felt a smile touch the corners of her mouth, not warm, not friendly, just the small satisfaction of someone about to deliver information that would shatter comfortable assumptions. She pulled her ID badge forward, so the credentials were clearly visible. Dr. Grace Monroe, cardiothoracic surgery, and watched Victoria's eyes track to it, watched confusion replace irritation, watched the wheels turn slowly as she processed what she was seeing. "Mrs. Monroe," Grace said, her voice still calm, still professional, but carrying an edge now that cut through the air like a scalpel. "I am a cardiac specialist. I'm the surgeon who's been assigned to your husband's case. And before we proceed with discussing his treatment plan, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, because pretending we're strangers when we're not isn't going to serve anyone." She turned her full attention to Richard, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his hospital bed, like he was hoping for a heart attack right now that would save him from this conversation. "Mr. Monroe, does your wife know? Does your son know what you did 20 years ago? Do they know about the 8-year-old daughter with a heart condition that you drove into the mountains and abandoned? Do they know that you left me there to die because I was too expensive and reminded you too much of my mother? Do they know that you never filed a missing person report, never looked for me, just erased me from your life like I'd never existed?" The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions so quickly they almost blurred together: confusion, disbelief, shock, calculation, and finally something that might have been fear. James took a step backward, his hand dropping from Richard's shoulder, his eyes moving between Grace and his father with growing comprehension and something that looked almost like horror. Richard made a small sound in his throat, something between a sob and a denial, his hands rising from the sheets in a gesture that could have been pleading or could have been defense. Grace continued without mercy, without softening, laying out facts with the precision she used in surgery when there was no room for error. "My name is Grace Monroe, though you probably wouldn't recognize that name because you had my birth certificate sealed and my medical records destroyed after you abandoned me. I'm the daughter of Elena Monroe, who died when I was 7, and Richard Monroe, who decided I wasn't worth the cost of keeping alive. You left me in those mountains with no food, no water, no medication for the heart condition that would have killed me within days. You drove away while I was screaming and begging you not to leave me. You did that deliberately, with planning and forethought, because Victoria here convinced you that I was a burden on your new family." Grace turned her gaze to Victoria, who had gone pale under her expensive makeup, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You remember, don't you, Mrs. Monroe? You remember telling my father that I reminded him too much of his dead wife, that I was costing too much money, that James deserved better than to grow up watching his stepsister slowly die. You remember suggesting that it would be kinder to let nature take its course. Well, nature didn't take its course. I survived." James was staring at his father with an expression Grace couldn't quite read, something between betrayal and disgust, and the terrible understanding of who his father really was beneath the successful businessman exterior. He spoke for the first time, his voice tight and controlled. "Dad, tell me she's lying. Tell me this is some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. Tell me you didn't abandon your own child in the wilderness to die." But Richard couldn't tell him that, couldn't produce the denial his son desperately wanted, could only sit there with tears streaming down his face, his damaged heart racing on the monitor, his whole body shaking with something that might have been guilt, or might have been fear, or might have been the terrible understanding that his past had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. "It's true," Richard finally managed, his voice breaking on the words. "Everything she said is true. I did it. I left her there. I thought she would die quickly, that it would be over within a day or two, that she wouldn't suffer long. I thought I was doing the right thing, the merciful thing. The doctors said her condition was terminal, said she'd only live a few more years anyway, said the medication was just prolonging the inevitable. And Victoria was right, she did remind me of Elena, and every time I looked at her I felt like I was drowning in grief. I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle the constant reminder of what I'd lost. So I made a choice, and it was the wrong choice, and I've regretted it every day since. And now here she is, alive and grown and holding my life in her hands, and I don't know if I deserve her mercy, but I'm begging for it anyway." Grace listened to this confession with no visible reaction, no satisfaction or anger or anything that would reveal what she was feeling beneath her professional exterior. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times over the past 10 years, imagined what she'd say when her father finally had to face what he'd done, what words she'd use to make him understand the magnitude of his betrayal. But now that the moment was here, she found she didn't need dramatic speeches or accusations. The truth was enough. Her existence was enough. Her success was enough. Standing here in her white coat, holding his life in her skilled hands, being the only person who could save him, that was the statement that mattered more than any words she could speak. Victoria found her voice finally, and it came out shrill and defensive. "You can't possibly be allowed to treat him. This is a conflict of interest. You're biased. You have every reason to let him die on that operating table. I'm going to speak to the hospital administrator. I'm going to demand a different surgeon, someone who doesn't have a personal vendetta against my husband." Grace turned to Victoria with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, the smile of a predator who'd finally cornered prey that had been running for too long. "You're welcome to try, Mrs. Monroe. But I'm the only cardiothoracic specialist in this region who can perform the specific procedure your husband needs. The next closest surgeon with my qualifications is in Seattle, which is a 6-hour flight that your husband's heart won't survive, and they have a 3-month waiting list that he definitely won't survive. So you can demand all you want, but at the end of the day, I'm his only option. Which means you're going to have to trust that I'm a better person than either of you ever were." James was still staring at his father with that expression of dawning horror, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "How could you? She was just a child. She was sick. She was your daughter. How could you just leave her to die?" Richard reached for James, but his son stepped away, putting distance between them, and the rejection on Richard's face was almost painful to watch even for Grace, who had every reason to enjoy his suffering. "I was weak," Richard said, his voice cracking. "I was drowning in grief, and I made a choice that destroyed me as much as I thought it would destroy her. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know that's not enough. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you both to know that I've paid for what I did. I've paid every single day." Grace pulled up a chair and sat down, bringing herself to eye level with Richard, close enough that he couldn't look away, couldn't hide from her gaze. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Let me be very clear about something, Mr. Monroe. You haven't paid for anything. You went home to your mansion, and your new family, and your successful business. You lived 20 years in comfort and privilege, while I learned to survive in the mountains with a man who'd lost everything but still had more humanity than you'll ever possess. Chen found me dying in a cave 3 days after you abandoned me. He carried me to his cabin. He saved my life. He taught me medicine, and gave me purpose, and showed me what a real father looks like. He's the reason I'm standing here. He's the reason I became a doctor. He's the reason I'm capable of saving your life. So no, you haven't paid for anything. You got to keep living while I had to rebuild myself from nothing. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. But here's what's going to happen. I'm going to perform your surgery. I'm going to do it perfectly, with all the skill and precision that Chen taught me, with all the expertise I've earned through years of training and dedication. I'm going to save your life not because you deserve it, because you don't. Not because I forgive you, because I don't. I'm going to save your life because that 8-year-old girl you abandoned deserved a father who would fight for her, who would move mountains to keep her alive, who would sacrifice everything to give her a chance. She deserved better than you. And I'm going to prove that by being better than you in every possible way. I'm going to show you what you threw away. I'm going to make you live with the knowledge that the daughter you left to die grew up to be the only person capable of saving you. That's my revenge, Mr. Monroe. Not letting you die. Making you live. Victoria started to speak, started to say something that was probably defensive or dismissive. But Grace held up one hand, and the older woman actually stopped, actually fell silent in the face of Grace's authority. Mrs. Monroe, you have 2 choices. You can trust me to perform this surgery with the same professionalism and skill I bring to every procedure, or you can try to transfer your husband to another facility and watch him die during transport. Those are your only options. Choose quickly, because he doesn't have much time. Victoria looked at Richard, then at James, then back at Grace, and something in her perfect composure cracked just slightly. She nodded once, sharp and bitter, the nod of someone who'd lost a battle they'd expected to win. James was the one who spoke finally, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he'd made some decision that would have lasting consequences. Do the surgery, Dr. Monroe. Save his life. He doesn't deserve your mercy, but maybe the rest of us deserve to not carry the weight of watching him die when someone could have saved him. He looked at his father then, and there was no warmth in his expression, no forgiveness, just cold assessment. But after you recover, if you recover, we need to talk about a lot of things. About who you really are. About what you're capable of. About whether I even know you at all. Richard's face crumpled at that. At the loss of his son's respect and maybe his love, at the realization that surviving physically might mean losing everything that made survival worth it. Grace stood up, smooth and professional, and made notes on Richard's chart with steady hands. The surgery is scheduled for Friday morning at 6 a.m. You'll need to fast starting Thursday night. No food or water after midnight. I'll have the surgical team brief you on what to expect, the risks involved, the recovery timeline. It's a complex procedure, and there are no guarantees, but I've performed it successfully many times and I'm confident in the outcome. Do you have any questions about the medical aspects of your care? It was surreal. Asking that question like this was a normal doctor-patient conversation, like they weren't sitting in the wreckage of a family destroyed by his choices 20 years ago. But Grace had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant treating the surreal as normal, treating the impossible as routine, treating trauma as just another problem to solve. Richard looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. This man who'd once held all the power in their relationship, who decided her life was worth less than his comfort, and asked the question that really mattered. Can you forgive me? Not now, maybe not ever, but someday. Can you forgive me for what I did to you? Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering the question honestly, reaching inside herself for an answer that wasn't colored by anger or satisfaction, or the pleasure of having power over him. When she spoke, her voice was softer but no less firm. I don't know. Maybe. But forgiveness isn't something you can demand or expect. It's something I might give you someday if you earn it, which would require you to actually change, to actually become someone capable of understanding what you did wrong. Right now, you're just sorry you got caught. You're sorry your choices have consequences. That's not the same as being sorry for hurting me. She moved toward the door, ready to leave him with those thoughts, ready to go back to her normal rounds and patient care and the life she'd built despite him. But she paused with her hand on the door handle and looked back at this family that had destroyed her and then been destroyed by their own choices. "I'll see you Friday morning, Mr. Monroe. Try to get some rest. You're going to need your strength." Then she walked out, leaving behind a hospital room full of people grappling with truths they'd avoided for 20 years, leaving behind a father who'd have to live with what he'd done, leaving behind a stepmother whose cruelty had finally come back to haunt her, leaving behind a half-brother who just learned his family was built on a foundation of unforgivable sin. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller immediately, because we bring stories where justice isn't simple and strength is earned. Don't subscribe? Comment, and tell me how you'll find closure without seeing how this ends. Here's the resolution. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray dawn that hospitals know well, that pre-sunrise light that filters through windows and makes everything look temporary and fragile. Grace had been awake since 4, her usual pre-surgery routine of mental preparation and physical readiness, reviewing the procedure in her mind step by step, visualizing every incision and suture, every potential complication and how she'd address it. She performed the surgery dozens of times, had success rates that exceeded national averages, had a reputation for remaining calm under pressure that other surgeons envied. But this was different, and she wouldn't lie to herself about that. This was her father on that operating table, the man who tried to kill her, and no amount of professional detachment could completely erase that fact. But Grace had learned long ago that feelings were something you acknowledged and then set aside when there was work to be done, when someone's life depended on your ability to function despite emotion. She scrubbed in with the same methodical precision she brought to every surgery, washing her hands and forearms until the skin was pink and raw, letting the familiar ritual calm her mind and focus her thoughts. The surgical team assembled around her, nurses and anesthesiologists and residents who'd worked with her before and knew her standards, knew that she demanded excellence and gave it in return. They moved Richard Monroe into the operating room while he was still conscious, his eyes finding Grace's face above her surgical mask, and she saw fear there, the primal terror of someone about to have their chest cut open, about to put their life completely in someone else's hands. She moved closer to his side before the anesthesia took effect and spoke in that low, calm voice she used with all her patients in this moment. "Mr. Monroe, I'm going to take excellent care of you. When you wake up, this will be over and you'll be on your way to recovery. Trust the process. Trust me." Richard's lips moved, forming words that came out slurred and barely audible. I'm so sorry, Grace. Please. I'm sorry." Grace nodded once, acknowledging but not accepting, and stepped back as the anesthesiologist administered the drugs that would put him under, watched his eyes flutter closed, watched the monitors settle into the steady rhythms of controlled unconscious state. Then she became pure surgeon, pure focused intention, everything else falling away except the work in front of her. She made the first incision with steady hands, opening his chest with precision that left minimal bleeding, exposing the heart that had given him life for 65 years and was now failing him the way he'd failed his daughter. The surgery took 6 hours, complex and demanding in exactly the ways Grace had anticipated. Richard's aortic valve was worse than the imaging had suggested, deteriorated to the point where removing it was almost impossible without damaging surrounding tissue, but Grace's hands knew what to do, had done this so many times that the movements were almost automatic even while requiring absolute concentration. She worked in near silence, calling for instruments and making observations about the surgical field, her team responding to her needs before she had to ask because they'd learned to read her rhythms. She replaced the damaged valve with a mechanical one, stitching it into place with sutures so small and precise they were almost invisible, testing the fit and function before closing, making sure blood flowed properly, making sure his heart could do the work it was meant to do without the obstruction that had been killing him. When she finally stepped back and let her team close the chest, when the monitors showed stable vitals and good cardiac output, when she could finally say the words "surgery complete" and mean it, Grace felt exhaustion hit her like a wave. 6 hours of absolute focus, 6 hours of holding someone's life in her hands, 6 hours of being responsible for every heartbeat, every breath, every moment between life and death. She left the operating room and went to the surgeon's lounge, pulling off her gloves and mask and surgical cap, sitting down heavily on the worn couch where she'd sat after hundreds of surgeries, letting her hands shake now that no one was watching, letting herself feel the weight of what she'd just done. She'd saved her father's life. The man who'd abandoned her, who'd left her to die, who'd chosen comfort over her existence. She'd cut open his chest and repaired his heart and given him years he didn't deserve. And she'd done it perfectly, with skill and care and the kind of precision that Marcus had taught her, that came from believing medicine was sacred regardless of who the patient was. Dr. Okonkwo found her there 20 minutes later, sitting in the quiet, staring at her hands. Her mentor sat down beside her without speaking, just present, just there the way good mentors are when their students need support but don't need words. Finally, Grace said quietly, "I saved him. His heart is functioning perfectly. He's going to live." Dr. Okonkwo nodded slowly, her hand coming to rest on Grace's shoulder. "I never doubted you would. You're too good a doctor to let personal history compromise your ethics. Marcus trained you well. But Grace, saving his life doesn't mean you have to let him back into yours. You did your job. You fulfilled your oath. What happens next is entirely up to you." Richard woke up 6 hours after surgery, groggy and disoriented the way all patients are after anesthesia, and Grace was there when he opened his eyes because she made a point of being present for all her patients in that vulnerable moment. She checked his vitals, adjusted his pain medication, explained what had happened in simple terms he could understand through the fog of drugs. The surgery had been successful. His new valve was functioning perfectly. He'd need to be on blood thinners for the rest of his life, and would hear a faint clicking sound from the mechanical valve, a reminder with every heartbeat of what had been done to save him. He'd need weeks of recovery, months of cardiac rehab, but he would live. He would have years he wouldn't have had without her intervention. Richard tried to speak, tried to say something that might have been thank you, or might have been another apology, but Grace held up one hand, stopping him. "Rest, Mr. Monroe. We'll talk when you're stronger. Right now, you need to heal." But Richard didn't want to wait. As the days passed and his strength returned, as he moved from ICU to regular cardiac ward to sitting up in bed and walking short distances with assistance, he became increasingly insistent about seeing Grace, about talking to her, about making her understand something he felt was urgent and important. He sent nurses with messages. He tried to call her directly, leaving voicemails on her hospital extension that went unanswered. He finally cornered her during her evening rounds, when she came to check his incision and review his progress, catching her hand before she could leave and speaking with an intensity that was almost desperate. "Grace, please. I need 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to talk to you about something important. I know you don't owe me anything, but please." Grace considered refusing, considered walking out without giving him the satisfaction of her attention, but something in his face, some genuine fear or urgency, made her pull up a chair and sit down. "5 minutes," she said, checking her watch pointedly. "And then I have other patients who actually need my medical attention." Richard nodded, gathering his thoughts, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for papers on his bedside table. "I've been thinking about what I can do to make this right," he started, and Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach because she knew where this was going, knew the only language men like Richard Monroe understood. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't give you back your childhood or your mother or the years we lost. But I can give you financial security. I've had my lawyers draw up papers that leave you 75% of my estate. Everything I've built, most of it will be yours when I die. The mansion, the investment portfolio, the real estate holdings, everything worth over $200 million. You'd never have to worry about money again. You could retire tomorrow if you wanted. You could do research, open your own practice, anything. Please, Grace, let me give you this. Let me try to make amends." Grace looked at the papers he was holding out to her, looked at this man who thought money could buy forgiveness, who thought wealth could erase abandonment, who still didn't understand that some things were beyond price. She stood up slowly, and her voice when she spoke was gentle but firm, the kind of gentleness you use when explaining difficult truths to someone who doesn't want to hear them. "Mr. Monroe, I don't want your money. I don't need your money. I have a career I love, work that matters, patients who depend on me. I have everything I need because Marcus Chen taught me that value comes from what you can do, not what you own. You're trying to solve a moral problem with a financial solution, and that's not how it works. You can't buy my forgiveness. You can't pay off your guilt. You can't write a check big enough to make up for leaving your daughter to die. She moved toward the door, but Richard called after her, his voice breaking. Then what can I do? Tell me what you need from me, and I'll do it. Anything. Please, Grace. I'm trying. Grace stopped with her hand on the door handle and looked back at this man who'd given her life and then tried to take it away. This man who'd shaped her through his absence more than he ever could have through his presence. You want to know what you can do? Live with it. Live with the knowledge that you made a choice that should have killed your daughter and instead made her extraordinary. Live with understanding that she survived despite you, not because of you. Live with seeing what you threw away every time you read about my surgical successes or see my name in medical journals or hear other people talk about the brilliant young cardiothoracic surgeon who's saving lives you'd have let die. That's what you can do, Mr. Monroe. You can live with your choices. And maybe someday, if you actually change, if you actually become someone capable of understanding what you did wrong, maybe then we can have a different conversation. But that day isn't today. Victoria never came back to the hospital after that first confrontation. Grace heard through the nursing staff, through hospital gossip that traveled faster than diseases, that Richard's wife had filed for divorce 3 days after learning about Grace's existence, that she'd moved out of the mansion and into a hotel, that she was demanding half of everything in the settlement and citing emotional fraud as grounds for dissolution of marriage. Apparently, Victoria Monroe had only ever been in it for the money and social status, and a husband whose past included abandoning a sick child to die was too much of a scandal for her carefully curated social circle to tolerate. The country club set was already whispering, already distancing themselves, already making it clear that Richard Monroe was no longer welcome in spaces where reputation mattered more than wealth. Victoria was cutting her losses, taking what she could, and disappearing before the taint of his choices could damage her any further. Grace felt nothing about this except perhaps a distant satisfaction that the woman who'd helped orchestrate her abandonment was facing some kind of consequence, even if it wasn't the consequence Grace would have chosen. But James surprised her. Richard's son, her half-brother, came to find Grace in the hospital cafeteria 2 weeks after the surgery, sitting down across from her without invitation while she was grabbing a quick lunch between procedures. He looked different than he had in Richard's hospital room, older somehow, like he'd aged years and days, like learning the truth about his father had fundamentally changed something in how he saw the world. He didn't speak immediately, just sat there turning his coffee cup in circles on the table, gathering courage or words or both. Finally, he said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I was 6 years old and I didn't understand what was happening, but I was there. I saw it. I watched from the car while Dad left you in that clearing, and I didn't do anything to stop it. I didn't scream or cry or refuse to let it happen. I just watched. And then I forgot about you, let myself forget, convinced myself it was just a bad dream or something that hadn't really happened. But it did happen, and I was part of it, even if I was just a child." Grace studied this young man who'd been given everything she'd been denied, who'd grown up in luxury and privilege, and the love of a father who'd thrown her away. She could have hated him, could have blamed him for being the golden child, the wanted one, the son who'd replaced the daughter who cost too much. But looking at him now, seeing the genuine guilt and confusion and pain in his face, she couldn't find hate there. He'd been 6 years old, a child caught in the dysfunction of adults who should have known better. "James," she said quietly, "you were a child. You're not responsible for what our father did. You're not responsible for your mother's cruelty. You're only responsible for what you do now, with the knowledge you have, with the choices in front of you." James nodded, but the guilt didn't leave his eyes. "I'm starting therapy," he offered, "trying to process all of this, trying to figure out who I am when the foundation I built my identity on turns out to be lies. And I wanted to ask, if it's not too much, if I could maybe get to know you. Not right away. I understand if you need space or time or never want to see any of us again. But maybe someday. I'd like to know my sister. I'd like to understand who you became despite everything that was done to you." Grace felt something in her chest soften slightly, not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it, the understanding that families were complicated and painful, and sometimes the people who hurt you were also capable of growth if you gave them the chance. "Maybe someday," she agreed. "When I'm ready. When you've done the work to become someone worthy of that relationship. I'm not saying no, James. I'm saying not yet. He nodded, standing to leave, but he paused and pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small framed photo that he set carefully on the table in front of her. Grace looked down and felt her breath catch, because it was a photo she'd never seen, her mother holding a baby that must have been Grace, both of them smiling at the camera, both of them glowing with happiness and love. I found this in the attic at the mansion, James said quietly. Dad had boxes of photos of your mom that he'd hidden away. I thought you should have this one. I thought you should know that she loved you absolutely, that whatever happened after she died, you were cherished once. Grace picked up the photo with trembling fingers, looking at her mother's face, at the baby she'd been, at the moment captured in time before everything went wrong. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite contain. Thank you for this. James nodded once more and walked away, leaving Grace alone with a piece of her past she thought was lost forever, with proof that before the abandonment and trauma and survival, there had been love, there had been a family that wanted her, there had been a mother who would have fought for her if she'd lived long enough to do so. That weekend, for the first time in months, Grace drove back to the mountains. The journey took hours, the roads growing narrower and rougher as she left civilization behind, climbing elevation into air that was thinner and colder and clearer than what existed in the lowlands. She called ahead, the one concession to modernity that Marcus had finally accepted, a satellite phone that let them stay in contact, even though he lived beyond where cell towers reached. His cabin looked exactly the same as it had when she left a decade ago, weathered logs and stone chimney, and the garden that still produced vegetables every summer, the place that had been her home when she'd had nowhere else to go. Marcus was waiting on the porch when she arrived, older now, his beard more gray than black, his body showing the wear of 70 years and a hard life in isolation, but his eyes were the same, sharp and kind and full of the love he'd never quite learned how to express in words, but showed through action every single day. They didn't speak at first, just embraced in the way people do when words are inadequate, when the connection between them was deeper than language could express. Marcus held her tightly, this daughter he'd chosen, this child he'd saved who'd grown into a woman who saved others, and Grace felt something settle in her chest that had been restless since the surgery, since facing her father, since having to decide between revenge and mercy. Here, in these mountains where she'd nearly died and been reborn, she could finally breathe properly, could finally let down the walls she maintained in the city, could finally be just Grace rather than Dr. Monroe, brilliant surgeon, survivor of abandonment, woman with something to prove. They made dinner together the way they'd done 1,000 times before, moving around the small kitchen with the choreography of people who knew each other's rhythms, Grace chopping vegetables while Marcus tended the stove, both of them falling into comfortable patterns that needed no discussion. Over simple food that tasted better than anything in expensive restaurants, Marcus finally asked the question he'd been holding back. "Did you save him?" Grace nodded, chewing slowly, thinking about how to answer honestly. "I performed the surgery perfectly. His heart is functioning well. He'll live, probably for another 10 or 15 years if he takes care of himself. And I told him that I'd done it not for him but for the little girl who still believed in mercy, who deserved a father who would fight for her. I told him that saving his life was my revenge because now he has to live with what he did, has to face every day knowing that the daughter he abandoned became the person who saved him." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the table, his eyes studying Grace with that penetrating gaze that always saw more than she wanted to reveal. "Are you at peace with your decision?" he asked finally. Grace considered the question honestly, reaching inside herself for the truth beneath the complex emotions of the past few weeks. "I am," she said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. "I thought revenge would feel better, thought that having power over him would satisfy something in me. But the truth is, mercy was harder than revenge would have been. Mercy required me to be better than he ever was, to rise above the hurt and act from principle rather than pain. And being better than him, being the person you taught me to be, that's the real victory. Not making him suffer, but showing him what he lost when he chose to throw me away." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age, his eyes bright with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "You became everything I hoped, Grace. Everything I dreamed when I found you dying in that cave and decided to give you a chance at life. You became brilliant and compassionate and strong. You became someone who heals rather than harms, who builds rather than destroys. You became everything Elena would have wanted for you, everything your mother would be proud of if she could see you now. Grace felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks, the kind of tears that come from being seen completely, from being understood by someone who loved you not for what you could do but for who you were. I couldn't have done any of it without you, she said, her voice breaking. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me knowledge and purpose and the belief that I was worth saving. You're my father, Marcus. Not him. You. You're the one who chose me, who fought for me, who showed me what love actually means. They sat together as darkness fell outside, the mountain night absolute and beautiful, stars appearing in quantities that city dwellers never saw. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Grace told Marcus about her plans, about the decision she'd been formulating for months but had only recently committed to fully. She was going to open a free clinic in the mountain communities, serving the forgotten people who lived too far from cities to access adequate health care, who couldn't afford the expensive treatments that saved lives in places like St. Catherine's Hospital. She'd use her skills to help people who'd been abandoned by the system the way she'd been abandoned by her father, giving them care that saw them as human beings rather than profit centers or charity cases. Marcus listened with growing pride and satisfaction, recognizing in her plan the echoing of his own choice decades ago when he'd left prestigious hospital work to live among the mountains, recognizing that she'd learned his deepest lesson about using privilege to serve those with none. The months that followed were busy with planning and execution. Grace negotiated with St. Catherine's to reduce her surgical load to part-time, giving her 3 days a week to work in the mountains while maintaining her skills and income from the hospital work. She found a building in a small town 40 miles from Marcus's cabin, an old general store that had been abandoned for years but had good bones and enough space to convert into a basic medical facility. She used her own money and fundraising from colleagues who believed in her mission to renovate it, installing examination rooms and basic equipment, stocking medications and supplies, hiring a nurse practitioner and support staff who were willing to work for less than they'd make in the city because they believed in serving underserved populations. The clinic opened on a cold morning in October, people already lined up outside before dawn, mountain families who'd driven hours to see a doctor who wouldn't charge them more than they could afford, who wouldn't turn them away for lack of insurance, who saw them as human beings worthy of care. Grace worked longer hours at the clinic than she'd ever worked at the hospital, seeing patients from sunrise until well after dark, treating everything from basic infections to chronic diseases that had gone unmanaged for years because people couldn't afford care. She sutured wounds and delivered babies and managed diabetes and heart disease and all the complex medical needs of a population that had been forgotten by the healthcare system. She taught health classes in the evening, educating people about nutrition and exercise and how to manage chronic conditions, empowering them to take control of their health rather than being passive recipients of whatever care they could access. She trained local volunteers in basic first aid and CPR, creating a network of people who could respond to emergencies before professional help arrived. She became part of the community in ways she'd never been part of the city, known and trusted and valued not for her credentials, but for her commitment to their well-being. Richard sent letters, dozens of them over the months that followed his recovery. They arrived at the hospital, thick envelopes with expensive stationery, letters that Grace imagined contained apologies and explanations and possibly more offers of money or inheritance. She didn't open them. She collected them in a box in her apartment, unopened and unread, not out of spite, but out of the simple recognition that she didn't need whatever words he'd written. His redemption wasn't her responsibility. His healing wasn't her job. She'd save his life because it was the right thing to do, because mercy was stronger than revenge, because being better than him meant acting from principle rather than pain. But saving his life didn't mean giving him access to hers. She built something beautiful from the ashes of what he tried to destroy, and she wasn't going to let him anywhere near it until, and unless he proved himself worthy of that privilege, which might be never, which might be something that happened long after she stopped caring whether it did. On the anniversary of Marcus finding her in that cave, Grace drove back to the mountains carrying supplies for the clinic and planning to spend the weekend with the man who'd saved her. They hiked together to the place where it had all begun, That shallow cave where she'd spent her first night alone, where she'd been dying and terrified and certain she'd been forgotten by the world. It looked smaller than she remembered, less terrifying, just a depression in the rock that had provided minimal shelter to a desperate child. Grace stood there looking at the place that could have been her grave and felt nothing but gratitude, not for the trauma but for the survival, not for the abandonment but for what she'd built from it. Marcus stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and said quietly, "You know what I see when I look at this place. I see the beginning of something beautiful. I see where two broken people found each other and decided to become whole together. I see where your real life started, not the one your father planned for you, but the one you chose for yourself." Grace turned away from the cave and looked out at the mountains stretching into the distance. Endless and beautiful and indifferent to human suffering, the same mountains that had nearly killed her and had ultimately made her strong. She thought about the clinic she'd opened, about the patients she'd treated, about the lives she'd saved and would continue to save. She thought about James and the tentative relationship they were building, about Dr. Okonkwo's pride in her achievements, about the surgical residents she was now teaching the way Marcus had taught her. She thought about Richard recovering in his mansion, alone now that Victoria had left, reading about his daughter's success in medical journals and knowing he had no part in creating it. She thought about her mother, dead but not forgotten, the woman in the locket who'd loved her absolutely in the time they'd had together. And Grace realized something fundamental about her story, something that had taken 20 years to understand fully. She didn't need Richard's redemption. She didn't need his apology, or his money, or his recognition of what he'd done wrong. She didn't need him to become a better person, or to understand the magnitude of his failure. Because she had already redeemed herself, had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into purpose, had survived when she should have died, and had used that survival to help others survive. She'd been thrown away like trash and had become treasure. She'd been abandoned to die and had become someone who saved lives. That was the story that mattered. Not what had been done to her, but what she'd done with it. Not the father who'd failed her, but the father who'd chosen her. Not the trauma, but the triumph that came after. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and purple, the kind of sunset that made you believe in beauty despite pain, in hope despite tragedy, in the possibility of building something good from the ruins of something terrible. Grace stood with Marcus watching the light fade and felt at peace in ways she'd never felt before. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of having transformed suffering into meaning, of having turned abandonment into achievement, of having become someone who helped rather than hurt, who built rather than destroyed, who chose mercy over revenge because mercy was the harder path and the better one. If this story moved you, if Grace's journey from abandoned child to powerful healer resonated with your soul, then subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller right now. We post stories of resilience, justice, and transformation every single week. These are the stories that remind you why strength matters, why mercy is power, and why some people rise from ashes to become fire. Hit that subscribe button, because next week's story is about a janitor who bought a failing school and turned it into the top academy in the state. You won't want to miss it. And if you're still not subscribing, I genuinely want to know. Come to the comments and tell me why. Tell me what's stopping you from joining a community that celebrates the human spirit. I'll be reading every single comment. Drop your country and time zone one more time if you're still here. I want to see who stayed until the end. You're the real ones. This is Olivia the Storyteller, reminding you that your story isn't over. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.